Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've held this in for the longest time and never thought I'd actually share it online. But after finding this community, I feel like maybe someone here will understand or have had similar experiences. This happened about 3 years ago, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. For context, I live in Pinewood Valley, a rural area where everyone kind of knows each other. I've always been the reliable friend with a decent pickup truck, which is how this whole thing started. My buddy Ethan Davis had been having car trouble and needed to haul some supplies to his place near his parents' cabin, so I lent him my truck for the day. When he returned it that evening, he insisted on having me over for dinner as a thank you. "I want to show you something too," he said, with this weird excitement in his voice. "I think I can finally prove what's been happening on our property." I didn't think much of it at the time. Ethan was always talking about strange things happening around his place. He lived in this small house on the same property as his in-laws' cabin, surrounded by dense woods. The place was about 20 minutes from the nearest neighbor, tucked away on this winding dirt road that got really bad during rainy season. I agreed to come over the following Saturday. It had been raining on and off all week, and the ground was completely soaked when I arrived. Ethan was standing outside waiting for me, practically bouncing with excitement. "Before we eat, I need to show you something," he said, already walking toward one of the muddy paths that led around his house. I followed, my boots sinking into the mud with every step. "What exactly am I looking for?" I asked as we rounded the corner of his shed. Ethan pointed at this huge mud puddle. "Look at that and tell me what you see." At first, I didn't notice anything special, just a puddle, but then I saw it. This massive footprint pressed deep into the mud. And when I say massive, I mean it was way bigger than my foot, both wider and longer. The impression was so deep you could see where toes had pressed into the earth. "Holy shit," I whispered, crouching down for a closer look. "What made this?" "You tell me," Ethan said, crossing his arms with this smug look on his face. "I've been telling everyone something's been wandering around out here." My first thought was, it had to be a prank. "Come on, man. You probably made this yourself." Ethan looked offended. "Morgan, I swear I didn't. Try to make a print like that yourself. Go ahead." I stepped into the mud beside the print and pressed my foot down as hard as I could. My boot made a decent impression, but nothing like what we were looking at. The mystery print was at least twice the size of mine, much deeper, and had these distinct toe markings that looked nothing like a boot. "We should preserve this," Ethan said. "I've got some plaster mix in the barn from when we were fixing the cow stalls. We can make a cast." I was skeptical, but curious enough to go along with it. We headed to this old barn where he mixed up some plaster in a bucket. It was sloppy work. Neither of us really knew what we were doing, but we managed to pour it into the footprint without messing it up too badly. "It'll need about an hour to set," Ethan said, looking at his watch. "Let's head back to the cabin. Dinner should be ready soon anyway." When we got to his in-laws' cabin, everyone was outside enjoying the brief break in the rain. His wife Sarah was tending to a small garden patch, while her parents sat on the porch drinking tea. It was one of those old-fashioned cabins with a big porch and rocking chairs, exactly what you'd expect out in these woods. "We found something," Ethan announced, clearly unable to contain himself. He explained about the footprint and the plaster cast we'd made. I expected everyone to laugh, or at least question it, but their reactions were weird. Sarah's mom just looked up from her tea and said, "Just stay away from the rabbit pens, please. Last time something got into them, we lost 3 rabbits. Sarah's dad didn't say much either. He just stood up, went inside, and came back with a pair of binoculars and an old shotgun. He handed the binoculars to me and the shotgun to Ethan. "Just in case," he said quietly. That's when I started feeling uneasy. These people weren't acting like this was a joke or a prank. They were treating it like a genuine concern. Things got more tense when Sarah came rushing up to the porch, her face pale. "Something was outside the rabbit shed," she said, her voice shaking. "I was just feeding them and heard this heavy breathing outside, like something big." I looked at Ethan, expecting him to comfort her or maybe laugh it off, but he just gripped the shotgun tighter. "Where? Did you see anything?" Sarah shook her head. "I grabbed the food and ran. I didn't want to look." That's when it started raining again. Just a light drizzle, but enough to make the whole scene feel even more eerie. I stood there on the porch holding these binoculars and wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into. "Let's check on that cast and make sure the rain doesn't ruin it," Ethan suggested. I reluctantly followed him back out. We stood at the edge of the porch and I lifted the binoculars to scan the property. The light was getting dim as evening approached, but I could still see pretty clearly through the lenses. I panned across the tree line, not expecting to see anything. That's when I spotted it. At the edge of the woods, partially hidden behind some undergrowth, was this dark figure. At first, I thought it might be a dead tree or something, but then I realized it was moving slightly. It was tall, weirdly tall, and seemed to be holding a tree limb in its hand. The shape was unmistakably humanoid, but there was something deeply wrong about its proportions. "Ethan," I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry, "look over there at the tree line." I handed him the binoculars, my hands shaking. He looked for a long moment, then lowered them slowly. "Jesus," he breathed. "That's it. That's what's been coming around here." We stood frozen, not sure what to do next. Part of me wanted to run to my truck and leave, but another part was morbidly curious. What the hell were we looking at? That's when I noticed movement closer to us, near the tractor path where we'd left the plaster cast. I grabbed the binoculars back from Ethan and focused on the mud puddle. What I saw still gives me nightmares. There was a hand, a massive hairy hand with this strange fox-colored fur, touching the plaster cast we'd made. The fingers were elongated, with no visible thumb, and the skin on the palm was this yellowish, human-like texture. I watched, completely horrified, as the hand carefully touched the edges of our plaster mold. "Something's at the cast," I hissed, passing the binoculars back. Ethan looked and then suddenly raised the shotgun. "We need to check on the rabbits," he said, his voice tense. "Sarah said she heard something there." I didn't want to go anywhere near that rabbit shed, but I also didn't want to stay alone on the porch. So I followed him, trying to keep my eyes on where we were going, while also glancing back toward the mud puddle and the tree line. We reached the rabbit shed without seeing anything unusual. The rabbits were all there, huddled in their cages, but definitely agitated. Something had spooked them. "Let's get back to the cabin," Ethan said after checking around the shed. We turned and started walking back, which meant our backs were to the mud puddle. That's when we heard it. This rustling in the tall weeds, followed by the distinct sound of bare feet slapping on wet, muddy ground. It sounded heavy, like whatever was moving weighed a lot more than a person should. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. I didn't even look back, just sprinted straight to my truck, jumped in and started the engine. Ethan was right behind me, yelling something I couldn't understand through my panic. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him. "Don't leave yet, we need to get the cast." There was absolutely no way I was going back for that plaster cast. "I'm sorry, Ethan," I said, already putting the truck in reverse. "I can't do this. I'll call you tomorrow." I drove out of there so fast I nearly got stuck in the mud twice. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking even after I got home and locked all my doors. Ethan called me the next morning, sounding eerily calm. He said he'd gone back for the cast after I left, but it was gone. Not just the cast. The entire footprint had been smoothed over, like something had deliberately erased it. I've never been back to Ethan's property after that day. We're still friends, but whenever he invites me over, I find an excuse. I can't explain what I saw through those binoculars or what made that footprint. I've tried telling myself it was just some weird animal, or maybe even a person playing an elaborate prank, but deep down, I know better. Whatever was watching us from those woods, whatever touched our plaster cast with that strange hand, it wasn't human. And the way Ethan's in-laws reacted tells me they've known about it for a long time. Sometimes when I'm driving home at night and my headlights sweep across the edge of the woods, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that tall figure standing there watching. And on rainy days when the ground is soft, I catch myself looking down at puddles, searching for footprints that shouldn't exist. I don't know what to make of what happened that day. All I know is that something is out there in those woods around Pinewood Valley, something that walks on two legs but isn't like us. And sometimes it gets curious enough to come closer to our homes than we'd like to believe. Story 2. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not usually one for posting on forums or anything, but after what happened, I've been desperate to make sense of it all. I guess I'm hoping someone here has experienced something similar, or maybe has some explanation for what my husband Mike and I encountered. 2 years ago, my life was completely different. Mike and I lived in a comfortable 3-bedroom house in Joplin, Missouri. I was a housewife who volunteered at the local library twice a week, and Mike worked as an electrical engineer. We had a son, Daniel. He was our whole world. When Daniel died in a car accident 3 years ago, everything fell apart. He was only 19, a sophomore in college with his whole life ahead of him. The house became unbearably quiet. Every room held memories that cut like glass. Mike and I were drowning in grief, barely speaking to each other, just going through the motions of living. One night, about 8 months after the funeral, Mike came home from work and found me sitting in Daniel's untouched bedroom. He sat down beside me, and for the first time in months, we really talked. We decided we couldn't stay in that house any longer. We needed something drastic to save ourselves and maybe even our marriage. Within 2 months, we'd rented out our house, sold most of our possessions, and bought an RV, a 32-foot Winnebago. Neither of us had ever even camped before. Our friends thought we'd lost our minds, and maybe we had, but it felt like the only way forward. That first year on the road was healing in ways I never expected. We traveled through 27 states, staying anywhere from a few days to a couple weeks. I discovered I loved this nomadic life. After years of being Catherine Thornton, grieving mother and housewife, I was just Kathy, a woman exploring America with her husband. I started keeping a blog about our travels, took up photography, and even learned to play the ukulele. Mike seemed happier too, especially when we were in natural settings away from crowds. By the spring of our second year traveling, we'd developed a routine and gotten comfortable with RV life. We were in California, making our way through Yosemite National Park. The dogwoods were blooming and the waterfalls were running strong from the snowmelt. It was gorgeous, but also crowded at the designated campgrounds. Mike had always been good at finding unofficial camping spots, places where we could park for a few days without hassle. He found what seemed like the perfect spot not far from the park boundary, a little clearing about a quarter-mile from an unpaved Forest Service road. It was far enough from the main tourist areas that we had complete privacy, but close enough that we could drive to the valley in about 40 minutes. We'd been there for 3 nights already and were planning to stay another 2. The days were warm, but the nights were still chilly, dropping into the low 40s. On our 3rd night, we'd hiked during the day and were exhausted. After a simple dinner of pasta and wine, we turned in early, around 9:30. I'm normally a light sleeper, especially in the RV where every sound seems amplified. But that night, I fell into a deep sleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up suddenly. My phone said 2:07 a.m. when I checked it after everything started. But something had definitely disturbed me. At first, I thought maybe an animal was outside, possibly a bear. We'd taken all the proper precautions, no food outside, trash secured. But bears are curious creatures. Mike was still sleeping beside me in our queen bed at the rear of the RV. Then it happened. The entire back end of the RV suddenly dropped, like someone had picked up the front end. The jolt was so violent that we both shot upright. Our water glasses crashed to the floor, and the cabinet doors all flew open. "What the hell?" Mike gasped, grabbing my arm. Before I could answer, the RV leveled out again, only to have the back end rise up this time. We slid down the mattress toward the front of the RV, scrambling to grab onto something. "Earthquake," I whispered, though deep down I knew this wasn't what an earthquake felt like. Mike shook his head, fumbling for the flashlight we keep by the bed. "Something's under the RV, or lifting it." The thought made my blood run cold. We were parked on solid ground. There were no slopes, no ditches. Something would have to be physically moving our 7-ton vehicle. Mike tried to stand on the slanted floor using the wall for balance. That's when we heard it, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. The deepest, longest breath, like a massive bellows inflating and deflating, coming from right outside our bedroom wall. It wasn't the sound of a bear or any animal I'd ever heard. It was bigger, much bigger. Mike froze for a second, then pushed past his fear and staggered toward the front of the RV. I wanted to call him back, but my voice wouldn't work. He made it to the driver's seat and hit the horn 3 times in quick succession. The response was immediate and terrifying. The front of the RV suddenly shot upward, sending Mike tumbling backward into the dining area. Items rained down from the overhead compartments. Books, binoculars, my camera. The RV was tilted well past 45 degrees, and I was certain it was going to flip over completely. I slid down to the bedroom door, which was now almost beneath me, clutching at the doorframe to keep from falling further. The refrigerator door swung open, sending food containers crashing across the tilted floor. A bottle of olive oil shattered, making everything even more treacherous. "Stop it!" Mike shouted at the top of his lungs. "Get away from our RV!" To my astonishment, the RV dropped back down. Not gently, it crashed to the ground with enough force to shake everything inside. For a moment, there was silence, and I dared to hope whatever it was had left. Then the slapping started. Something was hitting the outer walls of the RV, not in one spot but all around, moving from the back to the sides to the front. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, almost like communication, and it was strong enough to make the whole vehicle vibrate. Mike crawled back toward me, his face pale in the beam of the flashlight. "What the hell is happening?" he whispered. I shook my head, too terrified to speak. The slapping continued, punctuated by those deep, huffing breaths. Against my silent pleading, Mike reached up to one of the windows by the dining booth and pulled back the edge of the blind just an inch. The scream that came out of him will haunt my nightmares forever. He fell backward, knocking over the table lamp, and I saw blood pooling under his foot, where he'd cut it on some broken glass. "Mike, what is it? What did you see?" I scrambled toward him, grabbing a towel from the kitchen to wrap around his bleeding foot. He was shaking, struggling to form words. Face. There was a face right at the window, looking in. "An animal? A bear?" I asked, though I already knew it wasn't. He shook his head violently. "Not a bear. Not human either. It had fur. A flat, wide nose like a gorilla, but bigger. Different, like that old movie monster, the Swamp Thing, but covered in fur." As I pressed the towel against his bleeding heel, trying to stop the flow, we heard something that made us both stop breathing. Voices, or something like voices. They sounded like they were coming from males, but not human males. The sounds had structure like conversation, but interspersed with growls, whoops, and those huffing breaths. It was as if whatever these creatures were, they were talking to each other about us. We huddled in the booth, his bleeding foot elevated on my lap, listening to these otherworldly communications continue for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 to 15 minutes. The slapping on the RV had stopped, but we could hear movement outside, heavy footsteps circling our vehicle, occasional thumps against the undercarriage. Eventually, the sounds began to move away, growing fainter until we could no longer hear them. But we didn't dare move. Mike's foot had stopped bleeding, and I'd cleaned and bandaged it as best I could with our first aid kit. We sat there in that booth, holding each other, until the first grey light of dawn seeped through the blinds. Only then did we dare to move around the RV. The interior was a disaster. Broken glass, food and belongings scattered everywhere, cabinet doors hanging open. But the real shock came when we finally worked up the courage to step outside. The ground around the RV was covered in strange imprints, not quite footprints as you'd normally think of them. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and very wide, with what looked like 5 toe impressions. They weren't clear tracks like you'd get in mud. These were pressed into the pine needles and dry forest floor, visible only because whatever made them was heavy enough to compress the ground. But the most disturbing discovery was near the back of the RV, a massive pile of excrement still steaming in the cold morning air. It didn't look like bear scat or anything I recognized. On a bizarre impulse that I still can't fully explain, Mike took a small sample of it in one of our Ziploc bags. We later sent it to a lab through a connection of his from work, but we never received any results, and when we followed up, they claimed they never received our sample. We packed up and left within an hour, not even bothering to clean the RV properly until we reached a crowded rest stop nearly 100 miles away. We didn't report the incident to park rangers. What would we say? That Bigfoot or some unknown creatures attacked our illegally parked RV. They'd assume we were drunk or high, or just making things up. In the days that followed, Mike spent hours researching Sasquatch sightings in the Yosemite area. There were more than I would have expected, including several accounts describing intelligent, coordinated behavior among multiple creatures. One report from the 70s even mentioned RV rocking similar to what we experienced. It's been over a year since that night, and we're still on the road. We've never gone back to Yosemite, and we're much more careful about where we park now, always in established campgrounds with other people nearby. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear those deep, huffing breaths outside our window. I don't know what happened to us that night. I don't know what those creatures were. Part of me doesn't want to know, but another part needs to understand, needs some explanation for what we experienced. Mike's foot healed, though he has a scar that reminds us it wasn't just a nightmare. Sometimes I think about our house in Joplin, with its neat lawn and familiar routines, and wonder if we should go back to that life. But then I remember why we left in the first place, and I know we can't go backward, only forward, even if forward means living with this unexplained experience hanging over us. Has anyone else encountered anything like this in the California wilderness? Does anyone have any idea what those creatures might have been? I'm not crazy, and neither is Mike. Something happened to us that night in Yosemite, something I can't explain, and it's changed how I see the world forever. Story 3. I'm not a writer or anything fancy, just a 58-year-old mechanic from Northern California who spent most of his life fixing cars and hiking trails. I've been a widower for 15 years now, and my son Tyler has been my rock through everything. I never thought I'd be typing this stuff up for strangers to read, but after what happened last summer, I need to get this off my chest. Tyler was getting married to his girlfriend Kate after dating for 6 years, and we decided to go on one last father-son camping trip the week before his wedding. It seemed fitting. We'd been camping together since he was a little boy, just him and me under the stars after his mom passed. He's 23 now, and these trips have been our thing for as long as I can remember. We chose a spot along the Pacific Crest Trail, a stretch we knew well from countless trips over the past 17 years. Honestly, I was feeling kinda emotional about it all. My boy was getting married, starting his own life, and this trip felt like the closing of a chapter. I didn't tell him, of course. I just packed the cooler with his favorite beers and enough food for 3 days. When we pulled into the area on Friday afternoon, I immediately noticed something was off. The main campground was packed, every single official spot taken. This was strange for this particular stretch of the PCT. We usually came here specifically because it was quiet, away from crowds. There were RVs, tents everywhere, and way more people than I'd ever seen in this area. "What the hell?" Tyler said, scanning the filled campground. I was determined not to let this ruin our trip. "Let's hike a bit further and see if we can find something." We drove past the main area and parked at a small pullout. After grabbing our gear, we hiked about a mile east until we found an informal overflow spot along the eastern shore of Lake Elsman. It wasn't ideal, no picnic table or proper facilities, but it had a well-used fire ring and was secluded enough that we wouldn't have to deal with the crowd. Plus, we could still access the bathrooms at the main campground if needed. "This'll work," I said, dropping my pack. "At least we've got the lake to ourselves on this side." We set up our tents, got a fire going, and cracked open a couple beers. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky with oranges and purples. It was perfect. Just me and my boy, talking about his upcoming wedding, his job, my retirement plans. Normal stuff. By 9 o'clock, darkness had settled in completely, and that's when things started getting weird. The first sound came from across the lake. It was a long, drawn-out howl that didn't quite sound like a wolf, but definitely wasn't human either. Tyler and I exchanged glances over the fire. "Probably some drunk idiots at the main campground," I said, taking another sip of beer. A few minutes later, we heard it again, followed by what sounded like whooping. Tyler laughed and cupped his hands around his mouth, making a ridiculous woo-woo-woo sound back at them. We chuckled, thinking we were just joking around with some other campers. But then the response came, a deep, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't quite right. It sounded, I don't know how to describe it, primal, like it was trying to be human but couldn't quite manage it. "That's not people," I said quietly. "Could be coyotes," Tyler suggested, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "I've been camping in these mountains for over 30 years. I know what coyotes sound like. I know what bears, mountain lions, and every other animal in these woods sounds like. This wasn't any of those." The sounds continued for almost an hour, getting louder and seemingly coming from multiple directions now. What was strangest was how they seemed to respond directly to us. When we'd get quiet, they'd get quiet. When Tyler would make a sound, there would be a response that mimicked his tone, but in that strange, not quite animal, not quite human way. Around 10 o'clock, I realized I was feeling watched. You know that sensation, like eyes are boring into your back? I kept turning around, shining my flashlight into the woods behind our tents, but never saw anything. I also noticed something else strange. Despite the packed campground we'd seen earlier, I couldn't see any other campfires from our position. It was like everyone else had gone to bed ridiculously early. "I'm going to walk back to the bathrooms," I said, standing up and grabbing my flashlight. But as I started toward the trail that led back to the main campground, something stopped me. Call it instinct or whatever, but every fiber in my body was screaming at me not to leave our little circle of firelight. I turned back. "Changed your mind?" Tyler asked, looking up from poking the fire. "Yeah," I mumbled. "I'll go in the morning." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Dad, you're being weird. It's just some animals out there." But even as he said it, we heard something very large moving in the woods behind us. The sound of breaking branches was unmistakable. Something heavy was walking through the forest. The footfalls didn't sound like a bear's four-legged gait. They were spaced differently, more deliberate. "You hear that?" I whispered. Tyler nodded, his face suddenly serious in the firelight. We sat silently for a long time, just listening. The noises from across the lake had stopped, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. "Let's put the fire out and get some sleep," I said. "We've got a full day of hiking tomorrow." We doused the fire and retreated to our separate tents. Mine was closest to the lake, and Tyler's was set up about 15 feet away, closer to the tree line. I checked 3 times to make sure our food was properly stored in the bear canister and that the cooler was locked. I didn't think it was bears I was worried about, but old habits die hard. I must have fallen asleep despite my uneasiness, because I woke up suddenly at around 3 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, heavy breathing right outside my tent. Not just normal breathing, but angry-sounding snorts. Something was moving around our campsite, and it was big. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a weird, throaty vocalization that was part growl, part speech. It was like someone trying to talk through a mouthful of gravel, making sounds that were almost words, but not quite. I fumbled for my flashlight, freezing when I heard the creature move toward Tyler's tent. Through the thin nylon of my tent, I could see the beam of a flashlight. Tyler was awake too. Then I heard my son's frightened voice. "Dad, you out there?" Before I could answer, whatever was outside made a quick movement. I heard our cooler being dragged across the ground, then the sound of it being opened. Against my better judgment, I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing in our campsite was something enormous, at least 10 feet tall. In the dim moonlight, I could make out its massive, broad-shouldered silhouette. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and it was rummaging through our cooler with huge, powerful hands. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as it grabbed beer cans and food items, tossing them carelessly into the woods behind our camp. Its movements were both animal and human, fluid yet awkward, like it wasn't used to handling small objects. After emptying the cooler, it turned toward Tyler's tent. My blood ran cold as it dropped to all fours and lowered its massive head, sniffing deeply around the perimeter of the tent. I wanted to call out, to do something, but I was frozen in terror. The creature stood upright again and tilted its head back. It let out an ear-splitting howl, exactly like the sounds we'd heard across the lake earlier, but 100 times louder up close. The sound reverberated through my entire body. Then it turned and ran off into the woods. It moved on 2 legs, but would occasionally drop its long arms to the ground, using its knuckles for additional speed. The trees shook as it disappeared into the forest. As soon as it was gone, I scrambled out of my tent and ran to Tyler's. "Tyler, are you okay?" I whispered urgently, unzipping his tent. He was sitting up, white as a sheet, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. "What the fuck was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. We spent the rest of the night huddled in his tent, too terrified to sleep. We talked in whispers, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear walking upright? Some kind of escaped zoo animal? But we both knew it wasn't any of those things. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we packed up and practically ran back to the car. The campground was still full of people, but they were all gathered in a central area, many wearing t-shirts with silhouettes of what looked like Bigfoot. It hit me like a ton of bricks. We approached a guy who was setting up some kind of audio equipment. "Excuse me," I said, still shaken. "What's going on here?" he grinned. "Annual Bigfoot tracking convention. We're heading out to do some calls today. Were you guys over on the east side of the lake? We were broadcasting calls last night to see if we could get a response." Tyler and I looked at each other in disbelief. Those sounds across the lake, they were people with speakers trying to mimic what they thought were Bigfoot calls. "Did you hear anything back?" the guy asked eagerly. I cleared my throat. Yeah, actually, we did. We ended up telling them everything. I expected ridicule, but instead they were fascinated, taking detailed notes and recording our account. Some of them seemed almost envious that we'd had an encounter while they'd been doing this for years with nothing to show for it. They volunteered to come back with us to the campsite, but there was no way in hell I was going back there. We did tell them exactly where we'd been, and a group of them headed over to look for evidence. Later that day, before we left, one of them found us. He showed us pictures of massive footprints they'd found near our campsite and broken branches 15 feet up trees, way higher than a bear could reach. "You guys hit the jackpot," he said excitedly. "This is better evidence than we've collected in the last 5 years combined." That was a year ago now. Tyler got married the following weekend. I didn't tell his new wife about our experience until months later. She thinks I'm crazy, and maybe I am. Tyler refuses to go camping anymore and gets uncomfortable when I bring up what happened. As for me, I've become one of those people I used to laugh at. I've joined the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization and gone back to those woods 3 times since then, though never to the same spot. I haven't seen anything as definitive as I did that night, just strange shadows and unusual sounds. The guys from the convention still send me updates. Apparently, that spot has become something of a hotbed for Sasquatch researchers. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I'd have thought they were nuts or making it up for attention, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person in a suit. Whatever was in our campsite that night was something science can't explain. I still fix cars for a living. I still look like an ordinary old guy. But I'm not the same person I was before that trip. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those almost words, seeing those massive shoulders silhouetted against the moonlight. I've stopped telling people about it because I'm tired of the looks they give me. But I know what I saw, and no one can convince me otherwise. I just needed to get this out there. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing and is afraid to talk about it. Maybe I'm not crazy after all. Or maybe I am. Either way, I haven't been able to look at the woods the same way since. Every shadow could be hiding something, and every unusual sound makes my heart race. Whatever's out there, I hope our paths never cross again. Story 4. I've been lurking on this forum for a while now, and after reading so many accounts similar to my experiences, I finally feel ready to share what happened to my family. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family because, well, who would believe me? But here, I think some of you might understand. I grew up in rural Indiana, about 40 minutes from the nearest actual town, on a sprawling farmhouse property surrounded by woods. I was the second youngest of 7 kids, which meant I was usually left to my own devices unless my mom needed help with chores. Our property was beautiful, rolling hills, a small forest, and a decent-sized pond that we used for swimming in the summer and ice skating in winter when it froze solid enough. But there was always something odd about our home. My parents had strict rules that none of us really questioned until we got older. The main one was that we were never, under any circumstances, allowed outside the fence after dark. Sometimes there would be days when Mom would keep us all inside, even during daylight hours, with no explanation, except that it wasn't safe. Dad would take his rifle and patrol the property on those days. It wasn't until I was about 6 that I first heard my parents refer to the mountain men. They'd talk in hushed tones when they thought we couldn't hear, discussing missing chickens or disturbed cattle. Once, I overheard my dad telling my oldest brother James that if he ever saw one of the mountain men while out doing chores, he should back away slowly, never run, and come straight to the house. I remember asking my mum about the mountain men once. She just stroked my hair and said, "They were here long before us, Maggie. This is their land too. We just need to respect boundaries. When I was 7, I had my first encounter. It was mid-July, scorching hot, and my 16-year-old sister Eliza had taken me out on the rowboat in our pond. Looking back, I realized she was probably babysitting me, but at the time, it felt special to have her attention. Our other siblings were either helping with farm work or had summer jobs in town. The water was cool and inviting that day. Eliza was letting me practice rowing, laughing as I splashed and made us go in circles. We drifted toward the far side of the pond, closer to the tree line than we usually went. I remember the sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows from the trees across the water. I was laughing about something, probably some silly joke only a 7-year-old would find funny, when I noticed Eliza had gone completely quiet. Her face changed in an instant, her smile dropped, and her eyes focused on something behind me. "What's wrong?" I asked, turning to follow her gaze. That's when I saw it. At first, I just saw eyes, dark, unblinking eyes, watching us from behind a thick oak tree at the edge of the pond. As my vision adjusted, I could make out a face, partially hidden but unmistakably there. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it wasn't animal either. The face was broad, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. The skin looked leathery, a deep brown-gray color covered in patches of what looked like coarse hair. The creature had no expression I could recognize. It just watched us. Not aggressive, not friendly, just intensely observant. I remember feeling like a bug under a microscope. "Eliza," I whispered, "is that one of Dad's mountain men?" Eliza didn't answer. Her hands were trembling on the paddles she'd taken back from me. I could see sweat beading on her forehead, and it wasn't from the heat. We were drifting closer to the creature's side of the pond with the light current. "Give me the paddles," she finally whispered. But her hands weren't working right. They were shaking too badly to properly maneuver the boat. "I'll do it," I said, with the confidence only a child could have in that situation. I took the paddles from her frozen grip and tried to turn us around, but I was too small and inexperienced to make much progress. That's when it happened. The creature tilted its chin upward in a strange, deliberate motion and made a sound I'll never forget. A deep, resonant hooting that started low and rose in pitch, almost like an owl, but far more powerful. The sound seemed to vibrate through my chest, and birds scattered from nearby trees. The sound seemed to snap Eliza out of her trance. She grabbed the paddles back from me with sudden urgency. "Don't look at it," she hissed, though I couldn't help but do exactly that. As Eliza paddled us away with surprising strength, the creature stepped fully out from behind the tree. I gasped. It was enormous, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with a massive barrel-shaped chest and long, powerful arms that hung lower than a human's would. Its entire body was covered in the same dark brown-gray hair I'd seen on its face, though thicker on its shoulders and back. I could clearly tell it was male, though I didn't fully understand the anatomy at that age. What struck me most was how it moved, fluid and deliberate, nothing like the lumbering monster I might have imagined. As we neared our dock on the opposite shore, the creature walked to the water's edge. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might break my ribs. Then it did something bizarre. It crouched down at the pond's edge, leaned forward, and submerged its head upside down in the water. "What's it doing?" I whispered to Eliza. "I don't know," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Don't make any sudden movements." The creature held its head underwater for maybe 5 or 10 seconds before pulling back up and shaking off, water droplets flying from its hair. Then it just stared at us again, water dripping down its chest. When we reached the dock, Eliza helped me out of the boat with trembling hands. "Walk, don't run," she whispered. "Just walk normal back to the house." We walked through the narrow clearing between 2 sections of prairie land, my hand clutched tightly in Eliza's. I couldn't help but look back once. and what I saw was bizarre. The creature was moving away, back toward the forest, but not in a normal walking motion. It was taking these enormous, elongated strides, almost like it was skipping, covering ground with incredible speed, but without seeming to hurry. When we got back to the house, Eliza made me promise not to tell Mom and Dad what we'd seen. They'll just worry and won't let us go to the pond anymore, she reasoned. I agreed, though I didn't fully understand why at the time. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those unblinking eyes watching me. But gradually, the memory faded into the background of childhood experiences, becoming almost dreamlike. I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, or at least exaggerated it in my young mind. Until 7 years later, when I was 14. By then, our family had expanded the farm to include a small herd of goats. My younger brother Tommy, who was 10 at the time, had taken a special interest in them and was responsible for their daily care. He loved those goats more than anything, particularly that year's babies. It was early August, a hot, humid day, with that heavy feeling in the air that comes before a thunderstorm. Most of us were inside helping Mum with canning vegetables from the garden. Dad and my older brothers were in town getting supplies. Tommy had gone out to check on the goats, a routine task he'd done 100 times. He couldn't have been gone more than 10 minutes when the back door flew open with a bang. Tommy stood there, face white as a sheet, tears streaming down his cheeks, breathing so hard he could barely get the words out. "Mountain man," he gasped, "took the baby, right from my hands." Mom moved faster than I'd ever seen her move. She grabbed Dad's shotgun from above the kitchen door and told my oldest sister to call Dad on his cell phone. To me and Eliza, she snapped, "Stay with the little ones. Don't leave the house." But I didn't listen. As soon as Mom rushed out the door, I ran upstairs to the second-floor window that overlooked the back pasture and the goat pen. That's when I saw it, a massive figure dashing toward the tree line, something small clutched in its arms. It moved with that same fluid, powerful stride I remembered from 7 years before, covering ground at an impossible rate. The baby goat looked tiny in its massive hands. Mom raised the shotgun and fired 2 warning shots into the air. The sound cracked through the humid afternoon, and birds scattered from the trees. To my shock, there was movement from another part of the tree line, a second figure, also carrying something that looked like a baby goat. At the sound of the gunshots, this creature turned partially toward us and made a barking sound so loud and angry it raised the hair on my neck, even from inside the house. Then it too vanished into the woods, following the first creature. Mom stood there for a moment, shotgun still raised, before running toward the goat pen where Tommy was kneeling, sobbing uncontrollably. I raced downstairs and out the door, ignoring Eliza's shouts to stay put. By the time I reached the pen, I wished I'd listened to her. The mother goat lay on her side, neck twisted at an impossible angle, eyes open and glazed. 2 of the baby goats were missing. The third was huddled in the corner of the pen, bleating pitifully. Tommy was inconsolable. "It just reached over the fence," he sobbed. "It was so fast. I was holding the baby and it just grabbed it right out of my arms. I couldn't do anything." Mom put her arm around him, her face grim. "It's not your fault," she said quietly. "They've never been this bold before." That was the moment I realized that this wasn't some shared childhood delusion or family folklore. My parents had been dealing with these creatures, these mountain men, for years. That night, there was a huge argument between my parents. Mom wanted to move immediately. Dad insisted they couldn't just abandon the farm, their livelihood. My older brothers sided with Dad, saying they could set up better security, maybe even try to hunt the creatures. That suggestion made Mom go pale. "You don't hunt them," she said, in a voice I'd never heard before. "Your grandfather tried that. Found his hunting dogs hanging from trees the next day. 2 weeks later, we put the farm up for sale. We didn't move far, just to a more populated suburb about an hour away, still in Indiana. Dad commuted to a factory job, and we all adjusted to suburban life. But things were never quite the same between my parents after that. I've often wondered if my parents told the new owners about the mountain men. The property sold quickly to a young couple from Chicago who wanted to try the farming life. I drive by occasionally when I'm in the area. They've fixed up the house nicely, added some new fencing. I've never stopped to talk to them. Sometimes I think about going back to the pond just to see if anything's still there. But then I remember those unblinking eyes, that expressionless face watching us from the tree line, and the way it dunked its head in the water as if showing us something we were supposed to understand. I don't know what those creatures were. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some local variant with its own folklore, the name doesn't really matter. What matters is that they were real, they were intelligent, and they considered that land theirs long before we built our house and put up our fences. I'm 32 now with a family of my own. We live in Indianapolis, about as far from forests and isolated ponds as you can get in Indiana. My husband thinks my fear of hiking and camping is just a quirky personality trait. My children have never heard the term mountain men, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the backyard at dusk and the shadows grow long, I catch myself scanning the tree line of the small urban park behind our house. And when an owl hoots in the distance, my heart still skips a beat just for a second before I remind myself that it's just an owl. Just an owl. Story 5. I've debated for years whether to share this. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake. I'm 31 now, but what happened when I was 7 is burned into my memory like it happened yesterday. It was January 1999, one of those rare California snow days in Shasta that was heavy enough to cancel school early. I remember being so excited when they announced over the intercom that we'd be going home at noon because of the inclement weather, a term I didn't understand at the time but repeated proudly to everyone. My dad picked me up in his old blue Ford Explorer, and I could tell right away he had plans. He had that look, the one where his eyes got all crinkly at the corners because he was trying not to smile too big. "Hey, buddy, want to try out that new sled Grandpa got you for Christmas?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat, my backpack still half unzipped from rushing out of class. "Yes!" I practically screamed it. The red plastic toboggan had been sitting in our garage for weeks, and I'd been praying for enough snow to use it. Dad didn't take us to the usual sledding spot where all the other families went near Siskiyou Boulevard. Instead, he drove about 20 minutes outside town, following these unmarked forest roads I'd never seen before. When I asked where we were going, he just winked and said, "I found a special hill when I was cross-country skiing last weekend. Nobody knows about it." The road got bumpier the further we went, snow crunching under the tires. We finally parked in what looked like a small clearing. There were no other cars around, no signs of anyone else, just trees, snow, and silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, where you can almost hear the snowflakes landing. Dad grabbed the toboggan from the back, and we trudged through ankle-deep snow for about 10 minutes. I remember my boots kept filling with snow because I was too excited to properly tuck my pants into them. My socks were soaked within minutes, but I didn't care. When we finally cleared the tree line, I saw the hill. It wasn't just any hill. It was massive, at least to my 7-year-old eyes. A perfect, pristine slope covered in untouched snow. The sun was still high enough that everything glittered like someone had scattered diamonds everywhere. "Wow," I whispered, afraid speaking too loud might somehow ruin it. Dad pointed to the far side of the hill. "See over there? That's actually a pretty steep drop-off. There's a chain-link fence to keep people from going over, but we'll stay on this side." I nodded solemnly, though I was barely listening, too fixated on getting the sled on the snow. The first few runs down were pure magic. Dad would sit at the back of the toboggan with me between his legs, and we'd push off from the top. The wind would whip past my face, making my eyes water and my cheeks sting with cold. I'd scream with delight as we picked up speed, snow spraying up on either side of us. By the third run, I was begging to try it alone, but Dad insisted on staying with me. We had the entire hill to ourselves for about 30 minutes. It felt like we owned the world. I remember thinking this was the best day of my entire life. Then everything changed. We were at the top of the hill, catching our breath after climbing back up for maybe the 6th or 7th time. Dad was adjusting my hat, making sure my ears were covered, when his hands suddenly froze. His whole body tensed up. "What's wrong?" I asked, but he didn't answer. I followed his gaze across the valley to the opposite tree line, maybe 200 yards away. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and snow. Then movement caught my eye. Something dark was emerging from between the trees, something big. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd had bear safety drills at school, and I started mentally reciting what to do. Don't run, make yourself look big, back away, slowly. But as I watched this thing move, I realized it wasn't a bear at all. It was on all fours, but not like a bear would be. Its movement was wrong, more like a human trying to run on their hands and feet than an animal built for it. And it was coming straight toward us, moving fast through the deep snow, like it wasn't even an obstacle. "Dad!" My voice came out as a squeak. "Get on the sled, now!" Dad's voice was calm, but had an edge I'd never heard before. He didn't take his eyes off the thing approaching us. "What is that?" I asked, unable to look away. "Lucas, now!" He physically turned me around and practically shoved me onto the toboggan. I could feel his heart pounding against my back as he positioned himself behind me. We were facing the wrong way, toward the steeper side of the hill, not our usual path. The side closer to the cliff and chain-link fence. "Hold on tight," he whispered, and then we were moving. The toboggan picked up speed faster than ever before. The slope was much steeper here, and we were soon flying down the hill at a speed that would have been thrilling under any other circumstances. But all I could think about was the thing I'd seen. Was it chasing us? I had to know. I peered through my fingers. I don't even remember putting my hands over my face, and looked back up the hill. It was following us, not just following, it was cutting diagonally across the hill to intercept our path. And now that it was closer, I could see it better. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall even on all fours, covered in black hair, thick and matted with snow and ice. Not fur, hair, human-like hair but denser, hanging in clumps. I couldn't see its eyes through all the hair covering its face, like an overgrown English sheepdog, but I could see its mouth, God, that mouth. Wide and stretched across its face with these puffy, almost pink lips. Too human, too wrong. "Don't look back," Dad shouted, but it was too late. I'd already seen it. We were headed straight for the bottom of the hill, but the creature was gaining on us, moving with unnatural speed. It would intercept us before we reached the bottom at this rate. Dad must have realized this too, because he suddenly shifted his weight, causing the toboggan to veer sharply to the right. The sudden change in direction nearly threw me off, but Dad's arm tightened around my waist. "Cover your ears, Lucas," he yelled, and then he did something I'd never heard him do before. He screamed, not in fear, but like he was trying to scare something away. A raw, primal sound that didn't even sound human, coming from my gentle father. The creature was close enough now that I could hear its breathing, heavy and ragged, like someone who'd run too far. For a split second as we slid past, no more than 15 feet separated us. It could have reached out and grabbed us. It could have easily overtaken us, but it didn't. Instead, it stopped suddenly, rearing up slightly as we passed. For just a moment, the hair on its face parted enough that I thought I saw eyes. Dark, intelligent eyes watching us. Not with hunger or aggression, but with something that looked almost like curiosity? Fear? I couldn't tell. We hit the bottom of the hill hard. The toboggan skidded, tipped, and sent us both tumbling into the snow. Dad was on his feet instantly, yanking me up by my coat collar. "Leave the sled," he hissed, dragging me toward the direction of our car. I looked back one last time. The creature had climbed to the top of the sledding hill and was now pacing back and forth, looking not at us, but scanning the horizon in all directions, like it was watching for something else. We ran through snow that came halfway up my shins. I kept stumbling, and eventually Dad just picked me up and carried me, something he hadn't done in years. I could feel him trembling, though whether from exertion or fear, I couldn't tell. We were maybe halfway to the car when we saw them. 3 men dressed in what looked like military gear, camouflage pants, heavy jackets, and what I now know were assault rifles. They emerged from the trees to our right, moving with purpose. Dad stopped dead. He slowly set me down and pushed me slightly behind him. "Afternoon," one of the men called out, approaching us while the other 2 hung back, one speaking quietly into some kind of radio. "You folks out sledding?" Dad's hand found mine and squeezed so hard it hurt. "Yes, sir. My son had a snow day from school. We were just heading back to our car." The man looked past us toward the hill. "See anything unusual out here today?" Dad hesitated just long enough that I thought he might tell the truth. Instead, he said, "No, sir. Just enjoying the snow." The man studied Dad's face for what felt like forever. "Mind if I check something?" Without waiting for an answer, he patted Dad down quickly, checking his pockets and opening his jacket. He was looking for something specific. I realize now he was checking for cameras or recording devices. "What's your name, sir?" "Daniel Crawford. This is my son, Lucas." The man nodded to his companions who were taking notes. "Where are you headed after this, Mr. Crawford?" "Home. My wife is expecting us for dinner." Another lie. Mom had left 2 years earlier. "Which direction are you headed?" Dad pointed east toward Redding. Another lie. "We lived west toward Weed." The man seemed satisfied. "We're conducting training exercises in this area for the next few days. It's not safe for civilians. I suggest you use the public recreation areas from now on." "Yes, sir. We didn't see any signs saying it was restricted." "There will be signs posted by tomorrow. Have a safe drive home, Mr. Crawford." They watched us as we continued toward our car. Dad kept a measured pace, not too fast, not too slow, but I could feel the tension in his hand gripping mine. When we finally reached the Explorer, Dad helped me in, buckled my seatbelt with shaking hands, and then walked around to the driver's side. He started the engine but didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he sat there, staring at the steering wheel, taking deep breaths. "Dad?" I whispered, afraid those men might still be listening somehow. "What was that thing?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet. "I don't know for sure, buddy, but I think we just saw something most people don't believe exists. Like Bigfoot, I'd seen documentaries on TV. Maybe." He started driving, carefully navigating the snowy forest road. "But Lucas, listen to me. Those men back there, they're looking for it. I don't think they want to protect it. I think they want to capture it, or worse. Is that why you lied about where we live?" Dad glanced at me, surprised. "You caught that, huh? You're pretty smart for a 7-year-old. I felt a little burst of pride despite everything. "But why did you lie?" Dad was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Because when I saw that creature's face, I saw fear, Lucas. Whatever it is, it's scared and just wants to be left alone. Sometimes the right thing to do is to keep a secret if telling would hurt someone." I thought about this carefully. "So we're protecting it from those men?" "Yeah, buddy, I think we are." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature. Its strange movement, those 2 human lips, the way it had stopped and watched us instead of attacking. Dad sat with me until I finally drifted off, and when I woke up screaming from nightmares, he was there. But as days passed, something strange happened. The fear began to fade, replaced by a kind of wonder. Dad and I would talk about what we'd seen, trying to make sense of it. We looked up stories of Sasquatch sightings, comparing notes with what we'd experienced. None of the descriptions quite matched what we'd seen. Our creature had moved differently, looked different. I became convinced these beings needed protection, that they were more than just animals. They were intelligent, perhaps even sentient. Dad agreed. It became our shared secret, a bond that remained unbroken even when he passed away 5 years ago. Now, as an adult, I've developed my own theories. The military presence that day has always bothered me. How did they know to be there? Why were they so interested? Over the years, I've come to wonder if what we saw wasn't just some undiscovered primate, but something more extraordinary. Maybe even something not entirely of this world. Sometimes, I think these creatures might be monitors, placed here by something beyond our understanding, periodically retrieved or checked on. It would explain the government interest. I've never gone back to that hill. Part of me wants to, but mostly I'm afraid. Not of what I might find, but of what I might not find, or worse, who might be watching if I did go looking. To this day, I can't hear snow crunching underfoot without tensing up, expecting to see a dark shape emerge from the trees. I still wake up sometimes with the echo of Dad's primal scream in my ears, or the memory of those intelligent eyes watching us from behind a curtain of black hair. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't know if I'll ever know, but I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that move just at the edge of our vision, things that perhaps aren't meant to be found. And sometimes, the kindest thing we can do is to let them remain hidden. Story 6. I've always considered myself a city girl at heart. Born and raised in a concrete jungle, I spent most of my 20s in downtown apartments, surrounded by the comforting buzz of traffic and people. Nature was something I appreciated in carefully landscaped parks, or on the occasional weekend drive to see fall foliage. The idea of sleeping outdoors, with nothing but a thin piece of fabric between me and whatever lurked in the darkness? Absolutely not. That changed when I met Eric 3 years ago. He was everything I wasn't, outdoorsy, adventurous, and annoyingly perfect at setting up tents. Our third date was at El Capitan State Beach near Santa Barbara, where he insisted camping would change my perspective. Reluctantly, I agreed. To my complete surprise, I fell in love that weekend, not with Eric, though that came later, but with the outdoors. The sound of waves crashing as I drifted off to sleep, waking up to misty mornings with coffee brewed over a small fire, the simple pleasure of disconnecting from notifications and emails. I was hooked. Over the next 2 years, Eric and I went on dozens of camping trips. He taught me how to identify edible berries, build a fire in the rain, and navigate using landmarks instead of Google Maps. But something about our dynamic always bothered me. He'd introduce me to his friends as his city girl who's learning, with that patronizing smile that made my teeth clench. When I suggested solo trips to test my skills, he'd laugh. "Babe, no offense, but you'd be calling park rangers within 24 hours. When we broke up last spring, it wasn't dramatic, just two people realizing we wanted different things. But his condescension stuck with me, especially those words that played on repeat in my head. "You're not the type who can handle the wilderness alone, Madeline." So last month, I decided to prove him wrong, and maybe prove something to myself too. I chose Sequoia National Forest for my solo debut. Not the most remote choice, but challenging enough for a first-timer going alone. Impressive ancient trees, decent trails, and enough isolation to test my independence without being completely cut off from civilization. I spent weeks preparing, buying proper gear, studying maps, and reading forums about solo female hikers. I told my sister where I'd be and set up emergency check-ins. The morning I set out, my stomach was a knot of excitement and terror. What if Eric was right? What if I was fooling myself? But standing at the trailhead, breathing in that distinct smell of pine and earth, I felt something shift inside me. I could do this. I had to. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. 6 miles of gradual climbing through some of the most beautiful forest I've ever seen. Massive sequoias making me feel gloriously small, wildflowers dotting meadows, and not another human in sight. I took breaks when I needed, set up my hammock for an afternoon nap, and felt my confidence growing with each step. By evening, I'd reached my planned camping spot near a small stream, feeling ridiculously proud of myself. Day 2 is when everything changed. I woke with the sun, made instant coffee on my little camp stove, and packed up efficiently. The trail would take me deeper into the forest today, with about 8 miles planned before my next campsite. The weather was perfect, warm enough for shorts, but cool in the shade. Around midday, I came across a beautiful watering hole fed by a small waterfall. After checking that I was still on schedule, I decided to treat myself to a quick swim. The water was shockingly cold, but refreshing after hours of hiking. I floated on my back, staring up at the canopy of trees, feeling completely at peace. Then I heard it, even underwater. It was a scream, not human, not quite animal. Something between a howl and a roar that seemed to vibrate through the water itself. I jerked upright, water streaming down my face, heart pounding. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just absolute stillness. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and pathetic against the vastness of the trees. Nothing answered. After a few minutes of scanning the tree line and seeing nothing unusual, I convinced myself it must have been some kind of bird or maybe a mountain lion in the distance. Still, I cut my swim short, dried off quickly, and got back on the trail with a nagging uneasiness. About an hour later, I was passing a large meadow when movement caught my eye. About 50 yards away, I could see what looked like a buffalo hump. It was about 5 feet off the ground, dark brown and shaggy, moving slowly through the tall grass. As I watched, it lowered out of sight, then rose again. Down, then up, down, then up. My first thought was bear, but it was too tall and moving strangely. Maybe an elk, but the shape wasn't right. Whatever it was seemed to be deliberately staying low in the grass, and I had no intention of investigating closer. I quietly backed up a few steps and continued down the trail, walking faster than before. 10 minutes later, I heard that sound again, the same distinctive scream howl I'd heard at the watering hole, but more distant this time. It raised the hair on my arms despite the warm afternoon sun. I stopped to listen, but it didn't repeat. By late afternoon, I'd reached my planned camping spot, a small clearing near another stream, about 7 miles from the nearest trailhead. Part of me was tempted to push on and try to reach civilization before dark, but that would mean hiking an additional 7 miles, arriving exhausted after nightfall. Better to stick to my plan and get a fresh start in the morning. I set up camp methodically, focusing on each task to keep my mind off the weird experiences earlier. As I arranged my sleeping situation, I faced a choice: tent or hammock. The tent felt safer, more enclosed, but a stubborn voice in my head, that sounded annoyingly like Eric, whispered, "Told you you'd be scared." Out of pure defiance, I chose the hammock. The night was warm, the stars would be amazing, and I refused to let vague noises drive me into hiding. I ate my dehydrated pasta dinner, secured my food in a bear canister well away from camp, brushed my teeth, and settled into my hammock around 9. Despite my earlier uneasiness, the gentle swaying and the canopy of stars above me was magical. I drifted off, thinking that tomorrow I'd complete my solo journey and have proven myself once and for all. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. No moonlight filtered through the trees, so it must have been after moonset but before dawn, that darkest part of night. Something had pulled me from sleep, though I couldn't immediately identify what. Then I felt it, warm breath on my face. My first drowsy thought was that somehow a forest ranger had found me. "Hello?" I whispered, still half asleep and confused. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I was looking at a face just inches from mine, not a human face, not an animal face either, at least not any animal I recognized. It looked like a hair-covered caveman is the best way I can describe it. Wide-set eyes reflected what little light there was. A broad, flat nose and a mouth slightly open, showing teeth. The smell hit me next, a horrific combination of skunk spray, rotting meat, and garbage left in the sun. It was so intense I nearly gagged. In that moment, I fully understood the phrase, frozen with fear. I literally could not move, could not scream, could not even blink as this thing studied me. It was hunched over my hammock, its massive frame silhouetted against the night sky. It must have been at least 7 feet tall. When it made a low, rumbling sound deep in its throat, the beginning of that same howl I'd heard before, something inside me snapped. Pure survival instinct took over. I thrashed wildly, trying to free myself from the hammock, which now felt like a trap. The creature stepped back, seemingly startled by my sudden movement. I fell out, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs, but adrenaline pushed me to my feet. I didn't even think about my belongings. I just ran, stumbling toward where I knew the trail was. Behind me, I heard crashing sounds. It was following. I've never run so fast in my life. Branches whipped my face, roots threatened to trip me, but somehow I stayed upright, fueled by absolute terror. I had the bizarre thought that this is what prey animals must feel, that pure, mindless desperation to escape. After what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute, I realized I couldn't outrun whatever was behind me. I needed to hide. I veered off the trail into a stand of massive sequoias, finding one with a trunk wider than my car and pressing myself against it, trying to silence my gasping breaths. The forest went quiet, too quiet. I could hear blood pulsing in my ears as I tried to listen for movement. Was it circling around? Had it lost interest? Minutes stretched like hours as I stood there, barely breathing, my legs shaking so badly I had to press my knees against the tree to stay upright. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from me, a distant crack of branches, then silence again. I stayed frozen for what must have been at least an hour, too terrified to move. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear? No, it stood upright. Mountain lion? Definitely not. Person in a costume, in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning. The realization hit me with absolute certainty. I had just been face to face with what people call Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the thing most rational people, including myself until that moment, dismissed as legend. When my legs finally stopped shaking enough to move, I crept back toward the trail, stopping constantly to listen. Nothing. No sign of the creature. I found a spot where 3 fallen trees created a kind of natural fortress and squeezed myself into the center, sitting on the damp soil with my knees hugged to my chest. If this thing was nocturnal, maybe I'd be safe when daylight came. All I had to do was survive until sunrise. I don't think I've ever watched the sky so intently, willing it to lighten. Every sound made me flinch. An owl, branches moving in the slight breeze, small animals rustling in the undergrowth. What felt like years later, the blackness finally began to soften into gray. As the first pale light filtered through the trees, I allowed myself to breathe properly again. With daylight came a strange sense of unreality. Had I dreamed the whole thing? A nightmare triggered by weird noises and too many campfire stories? But the memory of that face, that smell, was too vivid, too visceral to be imagination. I waited until full daylight before crawling out from my hiding place. My entire body ached from tension and from holding one position for hours. I was covered in dirt, scratched from my panicked run, and desperately thirsty. My water bottle was back at camp with everything else. Part of me wanted to go straight to the trailhead and civilization, but my survival gear was at the campsite. After careful deliberation, I decided to risk returning in daylight, making plenty of noise to avoid surprising anything. Approaching my camp, I half expected to find everything destroyed. Instead, my hammock hung undisturbed, my backpack was where I'd left it, and nothing seemed to be missing. If not for the vivid memory and my scratched, filthy state, I might have convinced myself it was all a dream. I packed up in record time, hands shaking so badly I struggled with simple buckles. Then I hiked out, practically jogged out, covering the 7 miles to the trailhead in just under 3 hours. It's been 3 weeks since that night. I've told exactly 3 people, my sister, my best friend, and now, anonymously, here. My sister thinks I fell asleep and had a vivid nightmare. My best friend thinks I saw a bear and panic transformed it in my mind. Neither of them said it, but I could see it in their eyes. They think sleep deprivation and solitude played tricks on me. Maybe they're right. Maybe the human mind is capable of creating hallucinations so real you can smell them. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that something is out there in those forests that doesn't appear in biology textbooks. The strangest part, I'm planning another solo trip next month, different location, definitely bringing a tent instead of a hammock, but I'm going, because despite the terror, or maybe because of it, I did prove something to myself out there. I faced the most primal fear imaginable and survived. Eric was wrong. I can handle the wilderness alone. But I'll never again dismiss the stories people tell about what they've encountered in remote places. Some legends exist for a reason, and some creatures prefer to remain legends rather than facts. Whatever I met that night seemed content to investigate rather than harm me. And for that, at least, I'm grateful. I still wake up sometimes feeling warm breath on my face and catching a phantom whiff of that unmistakable smell. In those moments, I know with absolute certainty we are not alone in the forests of this world. Story 7. I never wanted to share what happened to me because I thought everyone would laugh or call me crazy. But after reading so many accounts here, I finally feel like someone might actually believe me. So I guess here's my story. I was 15 when I saw it. This happened during summer break in my hometown in Idaho. Our town isn't exactly tiny, but it's small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business. I was taking a summer school class, U.S. history, because I failed it during the school year. Not because I'm stupid or anything, just because I couldn't stand Mr. Peterson's monotone voice. I'd rather take the class in summer than listen to him drone on for another whole year. Anyway, it was late July, a Thursday afternoon. I remember because it was the day before our final test, and I was planning to spend the evening studying. The class let out around 3:30, and I decided to walk home instead of waiting for my mum to pick me up. It wasn't a big deal. I lived about 2 miles away, and there was this bike path that cut through a wooded area that made the walk a lot shorter. It was hot that day, like stupidly hot. The kind of hot where your shirt sticks to your back after walking for just 5 minutes. I remember having my earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly through my phone while walking down the path. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings, just trying to kill time during the walk. I'd walked that path hundreds of times before, in winter, spring, summer, fall, at all times of day. Nothing unusual had ever happened. It was just a normal bike path that ran alongside a creek for about half a mile before cutting through a wooded area that separated the school from my neighborhood. So I'm walking along, my eyes glued to my phone, when suddenly this massive shadow moves across the path right in front of me. Not like 20 feet ahead, I mean right in front of me. Maybe 3 feet away max. It happened so fast that I jumped backward and my phone went flying out of my hand. I heard the screen crack when it hit the pavement. That phone was only 6 months old, and I'd saved up forever to buy it, so I was immediately pissed off. I looked up, ready to yell at whoever had scared me, thinking it was probably some jerk from school. But what I saw instead made me forget all about my broken phone. At first, I thought it was a bear. My brain just went straight to grizzly because of the size and the brown fur. But in that split second when my eyes focused on it properly, I realized I wasn't looking at a bear at all. This thing was moving differently. It had crossed the path on all fours, kind of loping along, but the way its limbs moved wasn't bear-like at all. It was more fluid, like a gorilla or something, but much, much bigger. Here's where most people would probably freak out and run away. I didn't. I know that sounds stupid, but I've always been more curious than cautious. I mean, don't get me wrong. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat and I felt like I might throw up, but I just stood there, completely still, staring at the spot where the thing had disappeared into the trees. I must have stood there for at least a minute, not moving, barely breathing. Part of me was hoping it would come back out so I could get a better look, while another part was praying it wouldn't. And then it did. This time it emerged slowly from the trees, but it was standing upright, on 2 legs, and it was tall, so damn tall. If I had to guess, I'd say between 6.5 and 7 feet, but it felt even bigger because of how broad it was. It was carrying something in its left hand, some kind of shrub or bush it had pulled up. I could see the roots dangling down. Its fur was a dark brown color, similar to a grizzly bear, like I said, but in the sunlight, I could see reddish tints in places. The fur wasn't super long, but it wasn't short either, maybe a few inches. The face, though, the face is what convinced me I wasn't looking at any animal I'd ever seen before. It had this conical-shaped head, kind of pointed at the top, but with this droopy look to it. Its eyes were deep-set, dark, but definitely visible even from where I was standing. Its nose was flatter than a human's, but not like an ape's either. It was just different, and its jaw was massive. But the thing that really struck me was that it didn't look aggressive. It looked curious. It was staring right at me, head slightly tilted, like it was trying to figure out what I was or what I was doing there. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 10 seconds. I didn't feel threatened. Scared, yeah, but not like it was going to attack me. More like I was witnessing something I absolutely wasn't supposed to see. Then it just turned and walked back into the forest. It didn't run or rush, it just casually walked away, its back to me. That's when I noticed it had practically no neck. When it had looked around earlier, its whole upper body sort of rotated together, and the way it walked was bizarrely graceful for something so huge. Each step was deliberate, but incredibly quiet. I couldn't even hear twigs snapping under its feet. After it disappeared, I remained frozen for another minute or so. My brain was trying to process what I'd just seen. I kept thinking, that was a Sasquatch. That was actually a fucking Sasquatch. But another part of me was saying, there's no way that was real. Eventually, I snapped out of it and picked up my phone. The screen was shattered, but it still worked. I thought about taking a picture of where the creature had gone, but what would that prove? Just a bunch of trees? I decided to keep walking home, which meant passing the exact spot where it had disappeared. I don't know why I did that. I guess I just wanted to see if there was any evidence, any proof of what I'd seen. As I got closer to where it had gone into the forest, the smell hit me. I've never smelled anything like it before or since. It was this powerful, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, and something else I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. People always talk about Bigfoot's smell, and they're not exaggerating. It's overwhelming. I looked for footprints, but couldn't find any clear ones. The ground was pretty dry and hard from the summer heat. There were some broken branches and disturbed vegetation where it had walked into the woods, but nothing that screamed giant bipedal creature was here. I hurried the rest of the way home, my mind racing. When I got there, my mom asked about my phone, and I made up some story about dropping it. I couldn't tell her what really happened. I couldn't tell anyone, really. Who would believe me? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to convince myself I had seen something else. Maybe it was just a bear standing up. But I've seen bears before. This wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. The way it moved was all wrong. Those hands. I haven't mentioned the hands yet, but they were enormous. The palms looked bigger than baseball gloves, and the fingers were longer than bananas. I remember thinking those hands could easily wrap around my entire head with room to spare, and there was something almost human-like about them, but much, much larger and more powerful looking. The muscle definition was insane too. Even through the fur you could see how built this thing was. Not fat at all, just pure muscle, especially across the shoulders and chest. It looked like it could tear a small tree out of the ground without even trying. The next day at school, I was completely distracted during the final exam. I probably failed it too, but I didn't care. All I could think about was what I'd seen. Over the weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the library and checked out every book they had about Bigfoot and Sasquatch. There weren't many, just 3, but I devoured them all. I also spent hours online reading encounter stories. So many of the details matched what I had seen. The height, the gait, the conical head, the lack of neck, the smell. Reading those accounts gave me chills because they confirmed I wasn't crazy. About a week later, I finally worked up the courage to tell my 2 best friends, Ethan and Derek. We were hanging out in Ethan's basement playing video games when I just blurted it out. They both stared at me for a minute, then Ethan started laughing. Derek didn't laugh, but I could tell from his face that he didn't believe me either. Seriously, guys, I'm not making this up, I insisted. Sure, Jake, Ethan said, still chuckling. And I saw the Loch Ness monster in the town pond yesterday. Derek was a bit kinder. Look, maybe you saw a really big guy in a ghillie suit or something. People prank hikers all the time. But it wasn't a prank. It wasn't a guy in a suit. No costume could replicate the natural way this creature moved, or those hands, or that smell. I never told anyone else after that. What was the point? But I've never forgotten what I saw that day, and I've never looked at those woods the same way again. I've gone back to that spot many times since then, hoping to see it again. I never have, but sometimes, when I'm walking that path alone, I get this feeling like I'm being watched, and once or twice I've caught that same distinctive smell faintly in the air. The weirdest part of all this is that I wasn't scared of it. I mean, I was startled at first, sure, but there was something almost peaceful about our encounter. Like 2 different species just acknowledging each other's existence for a brief moment before going our separate ways. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. If it went back to wherever it lives and told others of its kind about the skinny human kid it saw on the bike path. Probably not. It's been 5 years now since it happened. I'm in college studying biology, partly because of that day. I want to understand more about life on this planet, especially the parts we don't fully understand yet. I know most people still won't believe me, and that's fine. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw. I saw a Sasquatch. And sometimes, when I'm hiking in remote areas now, I find myself looking a little more carefully at the trees and bushes, hoping for another glimpse of something that isn't supposed to exist. The most frustrating thing is having absolutely no proof, just my broken phone screen and my memory. No photos, no footprints, no hair samples, nothing. Just the absolute certainty that for about 10 seconds one hot July afternoon, I looked into the eyes of what might be the most elusive creature on the planet. And sometimes that feels like enough. Sometimes it doesn't. I still walk that path when I go home during breaks. The trees have grown a bit taller. The bike path has been repaved. Life goes on. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever made me question everything I thought I knew about the world quite like that encounter did. I don't know if I'll ever see another one. Part of me hopes I do. Part of me hopes I don't. But I'll never forget those 10 seconds. Never. Story 8. I'm not someone who believes in monsters. I'm 43 years old, work in insurance, and consider myself rational to a fault. My ex-husband used to tease me about how I'd always look for the logical explanation for everything. But what happened last summer near Mount St. Helens changed something in me. I still don't know what I saw, but I know what I experienced was real, and it terrifies me to this day. It happened in mid-June 2014. I'd just gotten home from work and was looking forward to taking my beagle Cooper for our evening walk. I adopted him after my divorce 2 years earlier, and he'd become my little shadow. I let him out into the yard to do his business while I changed my clothes, and when I came back downstairs to get his leash, he was gone. The gate was closed, but Cooper had dug a small hole under the fence, something he'd never done before. My neighbor was out watering her plants and said she'd seen him chasing a rabbit toward the tree line about 10 minutes earlier. I wasn't too worried at first. Cooper had wandered off once or twice before, but always came back within an hour, usually muddy and looking pleased with himself. But as dusk approached and there was still no sign of him, I started to get anxious. My property backs up to forest land near Mount St. Helens. It's beautiful country, but it's also wild. We have cougars, bears, and coyotes out here. A small beagle wouldn't stand a chance against any of those predators. By 7:30 p.m., with the sun getting low, I decided to go look for him. I grabbed a flashlight, Cooper's favorite squeaky toy, and some treats. I threw them in my Subaru and drove up an access road that follows a pipeline clearing into the woods. It's technically private property, but everyone local uses it for hiking and four-wheeling. The road gets pretty rough as you go up the hillside, with dense forest on both sides and occasional clearings where the pipeline runs through. I was calling Cooper's name out the window as I drove, stopping every couple hundred yards to whistle for him and listen. About 2 miles in, I reached a spot where the road widened a bit before a steep incline. Above was a sort of natural bench or ledge on the hillside, maybe 200 yards below the actual ridge. I couldn't drive any further because fallen branches blocked the path, so I parked and got out. The forest was so quiet it made me uneasy. Usually you hear birds, squirrels, something, but there was just this heavy silence. The air felt thick with mist rolling in, and that weird yellow-grey light you get just before sunset made everything look slightly off. I remember checking my phone. It was 8:15 p.m. and I had 2 bars of service. I walked a little way up the path, calling for Cooper and shaking his treat bag. "Cooper, come on, buddy. Treats!" My voice seemed to disappear into the trees without echoing. I whistled as loud as I could, then stopped to listen. That's when I heard it, crashing sounds coming through the underbrush, like something big moving fast. At first, I thought maybe it was Cooper running back to me, but quickly realized whatever was making that noise was way too big to be my 20-pound beagle. My first thought was bear, and I started backing toward my car, but the movement pattern was strange, not the lumber of a bear, but something more deliberate. The crashing got louder, coming from uphill and to my right. Then it emerged onto the bench above me, this pale figure, either white or light gray. From where I stood, I could only see its upper half, because the slope hid the rest. But what I could see was enough to make my blood turn cold. It wasn't a bear. It stood upright, moving with purpose along the ledge. It stopped about 35 yards away from me, just standing there, half hidden by the slope. I couldn't make out facial features clearly in the fading light, but I could see it was muscular, not bulky like you see in those Bigfoot documentaries, but strong-looking, with light-colored fur covering its body. I stood frozen, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I recognized. And then it made a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. The vocalization started low, this deep, guttural rumble that I could feel in my chest, even from that distance. Then it rose into this piercing scream that echoed across the hillside. It wasn't like a cougar scream or coyote howl, those I've heard before. This was something else entirely. It had intelligence behind it, like it was meant to terrify, not just communicate. My whole body started shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't look away, but every instinct was screaming at me to run. When I finally managed to turn toward my car, the creature bolted, not away from me, but uphill, crashing through the brush. I stumbled back to my car, fumbling with my keys, when I saw it again. It had reappeared on the ridge above, fully visible now against the darkening sky. It stood there looking down at me. I'm certain it was staring directly at me, and let out that same terrifying vocalization again. The sound bounced off the trees and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then it was gone, disappeared over the ridge into the deeper forest. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before getting them into the ignition. The engine sputtered when I tried to start it, and for one horrible moment I thought I was going to be stranded there. I remember praying out loud, "Please start, please start." And when the engine finally turned over, I nearly cried with relief. I backed up until I found a spot wide enough to turn around and drove down that mountain road faster than was safe. The whole time, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half convinced I'd see that pale figure following me. When I got back to my house, I sat in the car in my driveway with the doors locked for almost 10 minutes, trying to calm down enough to go inside. My heart was racing so fast I felt lightheaded. That's when I noticed Cooper sitting on the front porch, looking at my car like he was wondering what took me so long. He'd found his way home while I was out looking for him. I ran inside and locked all the doors and windows. I called my brother, who lives about 30 minutes away, but he didn't pick up. I tried my sister next, and must have sounded hysterical because she kept asking if I was hurt or if someone had broken in. I couldn't explain it clearly. Everything came out in a confused jumble. How do you tell someone you think you saw a Bigfoot without sounding completely insane? I kept saying it was light-colored, maybe 3.5 feet tall from the waist up, which would make it at least 6 feet tall overall. I didn't get a good look at the face, but the shape was wrong for a bear or any other animal I know. The way it moved was what disturbed me most. Purposeful, bipedal, like it knew exactly what it was doing. My sister said she and her husband would come over the next day to look for tracks or hair, anything that might explain what I'd seen. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound outside my window. Cooper was restless too, whining and pacing instead of settling in his bed like usual. The next morning, my sister, her husband, and my brother went back to the spot with me. In daylight, it looked so ordinary, just a forest hillside with a pipeline clearing running through it. We searched for tracks, but the ground was too rocky and dry to hold good impressions. My brother-in-law found some broken branches on the bench area that showed something had moved through there, but that could have been anything. It's been months now, and I still don't know what to make of what I saw. I've researched online and found reports of white or grey Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest, but they're rare compared to the typical brown or black descriptions. Some people call them ghost Bigfoot and consider them more aggressive or territorial. I've never been back to that section of forest. I still take Cooper for walks, but we stick to the cleared neighborhood trails and always in broad daylight. I installed motion sensor lights all around my property and got a security system. My family thinks I'm overreacting, that what I saw was probably just a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe even a person in light-colored clothing playing a cruel prank. But they didn't hear that sound. They didn't see the way it moved or feel that primal fear that goes beyond rational thought. That sound wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered. It was something else. I still work my insurance job. I still pay my mortgage and walk my dog and do all the normal things I did before, but something fundamental has changed in how I see the world. The forest beyond my backyard isn't just trees and wildlife anymore. It's a place where things I can't explain exist. And sometimes at dusk, when the light gets strange and the forest goes quiet, I think I can feel something watching from the tree line. I don't tell many people about what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw was real. And sometimes I wonder, if I could see it, does that mean it can see me too? Does it know where I live? These thoughts keep me up at night, staring at my ceiling, listening to every snap of a twig outside my window. Cooper won't go near that side of the fence anymore. Animals know things we don't. Maybe he senses something still out there, watching and waiting. I only know that I've lived in these woods my whole life, and I never felt unsafe until that day. Now I can't shake the feeling that the forest is hiding something intelligent enough to stay hidden, but bold enough to let me know it's there. I don't know if I'll ever understand what I encountered that evening, but I know this: whatever screamed at me from that ridge wasn't just an animal. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear that scream echoing through the trees. Story 9. I've been trying to make sense of what happened for 13 years now, and I still can't explain it. My wife Jennifer and I experienced something at Forest Lake that completely changed how we view the wilderness. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. It was late September of 2010, and Jen and I had planned a quiet fishing day at Forest Lake in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. We've always loved that part of Washington State. Pristine, peaceful, and usually empty, if you know when to go. We deliberately chose a Tuesday morning because we wanted the lake to ourselves. Both of us had taken the day off work, packed our gear the night before, and were on the road by 5 in the morning. The drive up was beautiful. Misty mountains, early fall colors starting to show, that crisp morning air that feels like you're the first person breathing it. We arrived around 7, and just as we'd hoped, the parking area was empty. No other vehicles, no campers, nobody. Perfect. We unloaded our small aluminum boat. Nothing fancy, just a 12-footer with a small outboard motor that served us well for years. Jen packed our lunches while I got the fishing gear sorted. It was one of those perfect Pacific Northwest mornings, cool but not cold, with that thin layer of mist hovering over the water that usually burns off by mid-morning. The lake was like glass, and the reflection of the surrounding pines and firs was so perfect it looked like you could step right into another world. We pushed off from shore around 7:30, and I steered us toward a quiet cove at the far end of the lake. It's a spot we'd had luck at before, a little inlet where the water gets deeper quickly, and there's fallen timber underwater that attracts nice-sized trout. The motor hummed quietly as we crossed the lake, and I remember feeling completely at peace. Jen was smiling, pointing out a pair of eagles circling overhead. It was just perfect. That's what makes what happened next so jarring. We'd been fishing for maybe 2 hours. We'd caught 4 decent-sized rainbow trout and released a couple smaller ones. The sun had burned off most of the morning mist, and we'd moved to the shade along the shoreline to escape the growing heat. We were in this little cove, probably 30 yards from the shore, with dense forest coming right down to the water's edge. It was around 10 in the morning, I think, when we heard it. At first, I thought it might be another fisherman, or maybe hikers on the shore. But we hadn't seen anyone else all morning, and the sound, it wasn't human. It started as this deep, resonant howl, almost like what you'd imagine a wolf would sound like, but much deeper, more guttural, and way too loud to be a wolf. Then it changed, transforming into this high-pitched scream that made the hair on my arms stand up. It echoed across the lake and bounced back from the surrounding hills, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Jen grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in so hard I had bruises the next day. "Tom, what the hell was that?" she whispered. I didn't answer because I had no idea, and honestly, I was scared too. We both instinctively looked toward the shore, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards to our right, standing at the edge of the lake, partially obscured by some low-hanging pine branches, was something. I'm still struggling with how to describe it because my brain kept trying to categorize it as something familiar, but it just wasn't. It was big, standing fully upright on two legs. At first glance you might think bear, but no, it definitely wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that way, and they don't have that silhouette. This thing was shaped like a human, but much larger. It was covered in dark hair or fur, a deep brownish-black color. From the distance we were at, I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but I could see that its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees. It was just watching us, not moving, not making any sound, just standing there observing our boat. I estimated it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, like a linebacker on steroids. The whole encounter probably only lasted 10 or 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Jen was squeezing my arm so hard it hurt. "Tom," she whispered, "is that a—" Before she could finish, the creature took a step backward. Its movement was fluid, not jerky or awkward like someone in a costume would move. Then it simply turned and walked into the forest, disappearing behind the dense trees and underbrush. No rushing, no crashing through the forest, just a deliberate retreat. We sat there frozen for what felt like forever. The lake was silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was like everything in the forest was holding its breath. Finally, Jen broke the silence. "We need to go. Now." I nodded, still staring at the spot where the creature had been. I started the motor with shaking hands, and we headed straight back across the lake to the boat launch. We didn't speak the entire way. What was there to say? We'd both seen something that shouldn't exist according to everything we'd been taught. As we loaded the boat onto our trailer, Jen finally spoke. "That wasn't a bear." It wasn't a question. "No," I replied. "And it wasn't a person either." "What do we tell people?" she asked. "Nothing," I said, after thinking for a moment. Who would believe us? The drive home was tense and quiet. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear standing oddly, a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit, a hoax. But none of those explanations fit. The way it moved, its proportions, the way it just stood there watching us. It was something else entirely. Here's the thing. This wasn't my first strange experience in that area. About a year earlier, I was hiking around that same lake with my stepfather Daniel. We'd gone off trail a bit, following a fire break that cuts through the forest about a quarter-mile from the shoreline. The ground was dried mud, and we came across a set of footprints that stopped us in our tracks. They were barefoot prints, human-sized or slightly larger, with 5 clearly defined toes. What made them so bizarre was their location. We were deep in the forest, in rough terrain covered with rocks, thorns, and thick underbrush. Nobody hikes barefoot out there. It would be painful and dangerous. The prints were deep, suggesting whatever made them was heavy. They followed the fire break for about 30 yards before veering off into the dense forest. Daniel and I didn't say much about them at the time. He just looked at me with this expression that said, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" We took some pictures on my phone, but they didn't capture the scale or clarity of what we saw in person. When I got home that night, I researched local wildlife and came up empty. Nothing native to Washington leaves tracks like that. After our encounter on the lake, I wondered if those tracks might have belonged to a younger version of whatever we saw. The size seemed consistent, large but not massive like the creature we spotted from the boat. There's more. A few years before our lake encounter, I had a co-worker named Mike who told me something that I dismissed at the time, but now seems incredibly relevant. Mike and his family, his wife and 2 kids, were picking huckleberries near Forest Lake one summer afternoon. They had wandered a bit from their car, maybe half a mile into the forest, when Mike's son pointed toward a thick stand of trees about 40 yards away. Standing among the trees was what Mike described as a hairy man. According to him, it was slightly taller than an average man, with a thick build and completely covered in dark brown hair. Mike said it was just standing there watching them. When it realized it had been spotted, it quickly retreated deeper into the forest. Mike grabbed his kids and they all ran back to their car, leaving their berry buckets behind. When Mike told me this story, I humored him but didn't really believe it. Now, I can't stop thinking about it. 3 separate incidents, all near Forest Lake, all describing something similar. A large, hairy, bipedal creature with human-like characteristics but distinctly wild behavior. After our experience, Jen and I did some research. We found dozens of similar reports from the Pacific Northwest, descriptions that matched what we saw. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to call it, but I know what we saw was real. The weeks after our encounter were difficult. I had trouble sleeping. Every noise outside our window made me jump. Jen and I talked about it constantly when we were alone, trying to make sense of it. We even considered going back with a camera, but something stopped us. Fear, maybe, or the realization that some things should just be left alone. What bothers me most is how normal everything was before we heard that sound. One minute we're fishing on a beautiful day, and the next, our entire understanding of the world is turned upside down. That contrast is jarring, the mundane and the impossible colliding in an instant. I've replayed that moment in my head thousands of times. The sound, the sight of it standing there, the way it moved when it left. Sometimes I convince myself it was just a bear or some other explanation. But then I remember the details. The proportions all wrong for a bear, the fluid bipedal movement, the way it simply watched us with what felt like intelligence. And I know it wasn't anything conventional science recognizes. We haven't been back to Forest Lake since. We still fish, but we stick to more populated areas now. Something about being alone in the deep forest doesn't appeal to us anymore. It's not just fear, it's this unsettling awareness that the wilderness holds secrets we aren't meant to understand. I don't expect everyone to believe this account. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. But I know what I saw. I know what Jen saw. And somewhere in the depths of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, there's something that shouldn't exist according to science, but it does. The most disturbing part is how it looked at us, with awareness, with recognition. Not like an animal seeing potential prey or a threat, but like an intelligent being observing interlopers in its territory. There was a consciousness behind those eyes that I can't explain and can't forget. It's been 13 years, and I still haven't found a rational explanation. I've spoken to a few trusted friends about it, and reactions range from fascination to dismissal. One friend suggested we report it to a Bigfoot research organization, but we never did. What would be the point? Without evidence, we're just 2 more people with an unbelievable story. All I know is that the forests of the Pacific Northwest hide something extraordinary. Something that watches from the shadows, that moves silently through terrain that would challenge the most experienced hikers, that can disappear without a trace despite its size. Something that doesn't want to be found, but occasionally allows itself to be seen. If you're ever fishing at Forest Lake on a quiet morning and you hear a sound that starts as a howl and ends as a scream, don't look toward the shore. Just start your motor and head back to the boat launch. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. Story 10. I've never shared this publicly before, but what happened to me nearly 30 years ago still haunts me. I can't explain it. And I'm not claiming to know exactly what I saw, but I can tell you what happened. Take it how you want. It was November 1993, and I was 23, working as a junior ad salesman and part-time photographer for the Lane County Herald. Not exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills and let me practice photography, which was my real passion. I lived in Mapleton back then, tiny place west of Eugene along the Siuslaw River, and I was commuting to Eugene several times a week. That morning, I had to be in Eugene early for a staff meeting. I left Mapleton around 5:15 a.m., still pitch black outside. Highway 36 follows the Siuslaw River and cuts through some of the densest forest in the Coast Range. If you've never driven it, especially in the early 90s, it was basically a two-lane road winding through wilderness. No streetlights, barely any houses, just trees, darkness, and the occasional logging truck. The fog that morning was ridiculous, like driving through soup. My headlights just bounced right back at me, creating this tunnel of white maybe 15 feet ahead. I had my window cracked despite the cold, because the windshield kept fogging up inside. The defroster in my '89 Civic was basically worthless. I always kept my camera bag on the passenger seat. It was habit by then. You never know when you might need to snap something for the paper. I had my Nikon FM2 with maybe half a roll of film left in it. Nothing fancy by today's standards, but it was reliable. I remember checking my watch at one point, 5:47 a.m. I was about halfway to Eugene, going maybe 35 mph because of the fog, coming up on one of the small bridges that crossed the Siuslaw. The sun wasn't up yet, but there was this faint grayness starting to seep through the fog. That weird pre-dawn light that makes everything look flat and colorless. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow or maybe a Department of Transportation worker. There was this shape at the edge of the road right before the bridge. As I got closer, I realized whatever it was stood at least 7 feet tall. I'm not exaggerating. I'm 6 feet tall myself, and this thing towered over what I'd expect from a normal person. It wasn't moving, just standing there, partially obscured by the fog, but clearly visible enough that I could make out a silhouette. The proportions were wrong. The arms hung way too low, like down to the knees. The shoulders were massive, easily twice as wide as mine. The head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders, with barely any neck visible. I slowed down, partly out of caution and partly out of curiosity. My first thought wasn't Bigfoot or anything supernatural. I figured it was probably a road maintenance worker in some bulky gear. But something about the stillness of it made the hair on my neck stand up. It didn't move as my headlights hit it, didn't turn to look at me, nothing. Just stood there at the edge of the asphalt, facing the river. My journalistic instincts kicked in. I pulled over about 30 feet away, grabbed my camera, and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately. That damp, bone-chilling cold that's unique to Oregon winters. The engine ticked as it cooled, and I could hear the river rushing below. Nothing else. No birds, no traffic, just the water and my own breathing. I raised the camera, framed the shot as best I could in the fog, and took a single picture. The click and whir of the shutter seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. I didn't have a flash attached, so I wasn't sure if the shot would even turn out. As I lowered the camera, the figure turned. Not like a person would turn. It didn't pivot at the waist or move its feet. The entire body just rotated, slowly, deliberately. That's when I felt the first real jolt of fear. Through the fog, I could make out the general shape, but not the details. It was massive, dark, and covered in what looked like hair or fur. Not a coat or gear, actual hair. The face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it looking at me. I know how that sounds, but I swear it's true. You know when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but 100 times more intense. I froze. We just stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it made a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a breath. Something in between that seemed to vibrate in my chest. That broke the spell. I practically fell back into my car, fumbled with my keys, and peeled out so fast I'm surprised I didn't wreck. In my rearview mirror, I could see the figure still standing there, watching me leave, until the fog swallowed it. My hands shook the entire drive to Eugene. I kept telling myself it was just a worker, or maybe a hunter in weird gear. But I knew that wasn't right. Workers wear reflective vests. Hunters don't stand motionless by highways at dawn, and neither workers nor hunters are 7+ feet tall with arms that hang to their knees. When I got to the office, I didn't tell anyone what happened. People already thought I was a bit odd, the quiet guy who took pictures of artsy stuff for a small town paper. Last thing I needed was them thinking I was seeing monsters on my commute. I did, however, develop the film that afternoon. I remember standing in the dark room, watching the image appear in the developer tray, my heart racing all over again. The fog made the photo grainy and indistinct, but there it was, a large, dark figure standing at the roadside. The proportions were just as I remembered, unnaturally tall and broad with those 2 long arms. My editor, Dave, saw the photo when I was hanging it to dry and asked about it. I just said it was something I'd spotted in the fog that morning that looked interesting, a study in shapes or some BS like that. To my surprise, he loved it, said it had an eerie quality that would make a great front-page image for the weekend edition. So there it went, my Bigfoot photo, right on the front page of the Saturday paper, with the caption, "Foggy morning on Highway 36, and my name in tiny print beneath it. No mention of what it might be, just presented as an artistic shot of fog and shapes. The reaction was immediate. Monday morning, the office got a dozen calls from people asking about the photo. Some thought it was just a tree or a road sign. Others were convinced it was a man. A few, more than I expected, called to say they knew exactly what it was, a Sasquatch. I played it cool. Told the callers and my co-workers it was probably just a highway worker caught in an interesting pose by the fog and camera angle. But privately, I started researching. The internet wasn't what it is now, but the library had books on Pacific Northwest folklore. I learned that the Coast Range, particularly around the Siuslaw National Forest, had a long history of Bigfoot sightings going back to indigenous stories. For a few weeks, that was it. The photo became yesterday's news, and I went back to taking pictures of high school football games and Chamber of Commerce luncheons. I still drove that same route every day, but I never saw the figure again. Sometimes I'd slow down at that bridge, half hoping and half dreading another sighting, but there was nothing. Then, about 3 years later, in early 1997, I got a call at work from a man who introduced himself as Calvin Thornton. He said he was part of a research group studying unexplained phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. They'd come across my photo, which had apparently been circulating in certain circles. Calvin was different from what I expected. He wasn't some wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. He spoke carefully, like an academic, and asked if I'd be willing to meet him for coffee to discuss the photograph. Curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. We met at a small cafe in Eugene. Calvin was maybe 50, neatly dressed, with glasses and a trim beard. He brought a folder full of papers and photos. That's when I learned my picture wasn't an isolated incident. Your photograph matches at least 7 other documented sightings in Lane and Douglas counties from the past decade, he told me, spreading out a map marked with red dots. The proportions, the posture, it's consistent with what we classify as a Type 2 encounter. He showed me other photos, most much blurrier than mine, and handwritten accounts from locals, a logging crew that found enormous footprints and heard strange vocalizations near Deadwood, a hunter who saw a large, upright figure walking through a clearing near his tree stand at dawn, a family near Triangle Lake who woke to their dogs going crazy and found footprints twice the size of a man's boot crossing their property. People don't report these things officially, Calvin explained. They're afraid of ridicule, but they tell their neighbors, their friends. We collect these stories. When I finally admitted what I'd actually seen that morning, the way it moved, the sound it made, Calvin didn't seem surprised. "The Coast Range has always been active," he said. "The indigenous peoples had names for these beings. They weren't considered mythical, they were just another part of the forest, like bears or wolves, but rarer and more dangerous to encounter." I asked him what he thought they were. He shrugged. "An undocumented primate species is the most likely explanation. Territorial, primarily nocturnal, with a low population density. The forests here are vast and dense enough that a small population could remain hidden, especially if they're intelligent enough to avoid human contact." That made it sound so clinical, so possible, but it didn't explain the feeling I had when it looked at me, that sense of something ancient and aware staring back. After meeting Calvin, I found myself watching the forests differently when I drove. I'd scan the tree line, especially in the early mornings or evenings. I started keeping a journal of anything unusual. Strange sounds at night, reports from locals about missing pets or livestock, areas where people felt uncomfortable hiking. About a month after our meeting, I went back to the spot where I'd seen the figure. It was a Saturday, mid-morning, clear weather. I brought my camera and hiked down from the road to the riverbank looking for, I don't know what. Evidence, I guess. I didn't find footprints or hair. What I did find, about 20 yards from the road into the brush, was a small clearing where the vegetation was crushed down in a rough circle about 7 feet in diameter. In the center lay the carcass of a deer, partially eaten, with the bones broken open in a way I'd never seen before, not like coyotes or cougars kill. The marrow had been extracted from every major bone. I took photos but never showed them to anyone except Calvin. He said large primates, including some apes, will break bones to get at marrow. It's rich in nutrients. I left Lane County the following year for a job in Portland. I told myself it was for my career, but if I'm honest, that stretch of highway started to feel oppressive. I'd get this tight feeling in my chest every time I drove through the fog there, like I was being watched. Over the years, I've occasionally seen my photo turn up on websites about Bigfoot sightings. It's usually labeled something like "Possible Sasquatch Sighting, Oregon Coast Range, 1993. Some sites analyze it pixel by pixel, arguing over whether the proportions match a human or something else. Others dismiss it as just another blurry nothing. I don't argue either way anymore. I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel. That's enough for me. Last year I drove that stretch of Highway 36 for the first time in over a decade. It was summer, middle of the day, beautiful weather, nothing like the conditions when I took that photo. As I approached the bridge, I found myself slowing down, scanning the tree line despite myself. There was nothing there, of course, just sunshine, trees, and the river below. But as I crossed the bridge, I swear I felt that same tingling sensation on the back of my neck, that feeling of being watched by something hidden and patient. I didn't stop. I didn't take any pictures. I just drove, a little faster than necessary, until I was well clear of that stretch of forest. Some things once seen change how you perceive the world forever. I still don't know exactly what was standing on the roadside that foggy November morning, but I know it saw me too. And sometimes in my dreams, I'm still there, standing in the cold mist, camera in hand, as that massive shape slowly turns to face me. Story 11. I've been hesitant to share this for years, but I need to get it off my chest. Back in October 2008, I experienced something in the backcountry of British Columbia that I still can't fully explain, and it honestly changed the way I look at wilderness forever. I'm a long-time hunter from Montana, been hunting most of my life. That year, some buddies and I decided to book a guided brown bear hunt in a really remote part of coastal BC near the Skeena River. Our group consisted of myself, 2 friends from back home, Mike and Dave, and 2 local guides, Terrence and Keith. We'd been planning this trip for over a year, saved up for it, and were beyond excited. We flew into Vancouver, then caught a smaller plane to a tiny regional airport before driving 5 hours on increasingly rough roads. The last part was on logging roads, so unmaintained that we had to stop several times to move fallen branches. By the time we reached our base camp, we hadn't seen another vehicle for over 3 hours. That's how remote this place was. The landscape was breathtaking but intimidating. Massive old-growth forests, steep valleys, rushing creeks and mountains that seemed to go on forever. The kind of wilderness that makes you feel really small. Our camp was set up near a riverbend with a small clearing, just enough space for our tents and gear. The first 3 days of our hunt were tough. Lots of hiking through dense underbrush, crossing cold streams, and dealing with the constant drizzle, typical of coastal BC in fall. We spotted some bear signs, scat, scratched trees, tracks, but nothing worth pursuing. By the 4th day, I was starting to wonder if we'd go home empty-handed. That morning, we split into 2 groups. Mike went with Keith to check out a ridge to the north, while Dave, Terence and I headed toward a valley where Terence had seen promising signs the previous evening. The weather had cleared somewhat, and there was this eerie mist hanging in the forest that made everything look surreal. Around midday, we came across an area that immediately caught our attention. It was near a small creek surrounded by berry bushes, mostly wild blueberries and salmonberries from what I could tell. The place was completely torn up. And I don't mean just a little disturbed, I mean it looked like a bulldozer had gone through. Berry bushes were ripped apart, small trees shattered, and there were patches of fur scattered across about a 20-yard area. My first thought was that 2 bears had gotten into a territorial fight. That happens, especially during berry season when they're fattening up for winter. Terence, who'd been guiding in these parts for over 20 years, looked concerned though. He kept scanning the tree line and sniffing the air. "Something big went down here," he said quietly. "And recently too. Maybe last night or early this morning." While examining the area, I noticed something peculiar. A large tree branch on the ground, about 4 or 5 feet long and maybe 6 inches thick at the base. It had clearly been broken off from a nearby pine. What caught my eye was that one end was covered in blood and fur. It didn't look like it had just fallen naturally. It looked like it had been used as a weapon. I pointed it out to Terence, who examined it without touching it. "Never seen a bear use a stick," he muttered. Dave, who'd been circling the perimeter of the disturbed area, called us over. He'd found fresh bear tracks heading east toward a rocky outcropping about half a mile away. They were big prints, suggesting a mature coastal brown, probably a male. Terence studied them and nodded. "That's our bear. Looks injured from the way the right back paw is dragging. Something roughed him up good." We decided to follow the tracks. As we moved through the dense forest, I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's off, and every instinct was telling me we weren't alone. I kept looking back over my shoulder, but the forest was still. About 40 minutes later, we spotted him, an enormous brown bear bedded down under a rock overhang, licking what appeared to be wounds on his front legs. Even from our position, about 80 yards away, I could tell this was a monster bear, easily 9 to 10 feet long. Through my binoculars, I could see patches where fur had been ripped out and what looked like claw marks across his chest. We set up for the shot. I was using my .375 H&H Magnum, a rifle I'd taken to Africa and Alaska before, perfect for big, dangerous game. I steadied my breathing, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the valley. The bear lunged forward, then collapsed. A clean kill. After waiting the appropriate time to make sure the bear was truly down, we approached. Up close, the bear was even more impressive, and his injuries more baffling. This wasn't just any bear. It was one of the largest coastal browns I'd ever seen, probably weighing close to 200 pounds. But it was the wounds that left me confused. There were claw marks across his chest and abdomen, but they didn't match the pattern of bear claws. Most bear attacks leave 4 parallel slashes. These had 5 distinct marks, with one positioned almost like, well, like an opposable thumb. The spacing was all wrong for a bear too wide. The bear had patches of fur missing, not cut but pulled out from the roots, and on his back and shoulders there were bite marks, wide, curved impressions that formed an almost horseshoe pattern. They weren't the narrow, sharp bites you'd expect from another bear's canines. They looked more like something with flatter, more rounded teeth had clamped down with tremendous force. What struck me most was the smell. I've skinned many bears over the years, and there's always an odor. But this was different, a powerful, musky stench concentrated around the wounds on the bear's back. It reminded me of wet dog combined with something rotten, but much more intense. "What do you make of this?" I asked Terence, pointing to the 5-fingered claw marks. He examined them closely, then straightened up and took a step back. He looked around nervously before responding. "You believe in legends, Jay?" he asked quietly. "Depends on the legend," I replied. "Local indigenous people have stories about the wild ones who live in these valleys," he said, lowering his voice, even though there was nobody else around for miles. "Most outsiders call them Sasquatch." Dave chuckled nervously. "Come on, man, Bigfoot, seriously?" Terence didn't smile. "I've been guiding in these parts for 2 decades. I've seen things I can't explain. Tracks too big for any bear. Structures made of branches that no human built. Strange calls in the night that don't match any known animal." I wanted to dismiss it, but looking at those unusual 5-fingered marks, I couldn't come up with a better explanation. The evidence was literally right in front of us. "So, what happened here?" I asked. Terence surveyed the scene again. "My guess? That disturbed area we found was probably where a female and maybe youngsters were gathering berries. This big boy here surprised them, and the male defended them." "Male what?" Dave asked, though I think we all knew what Terence meant. "Sasquatch. Probably a big one, I'd guess 9 feet tall, 700 or 800 pounds. Bear surprised the female and young male, attacked to defend them. Used that branch we found as a club, then went hand to hand when the bear fought back. It sounded crazy, absolutely insane. Yet looking at the evidence, it was hard to dismiss entirely. We spent the next couple hours skinning and quartering the bear. The more we worked, the more unusual details emerged. There were hand-like impressions on the bear's throat, suggesting something had gripped it from behind while biting into its shoulder. Some of the bear's ribs were broken in a pattern consistent with being squeezed or hugged with tremendous force. While working, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every few minutes, I'd scan the tree line, expecting to see something watching us. The forest seemed unusually quiet too. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering. Just the sound of our knives and the occasional gust of wind. It took us until almost dusk to finish processing the bear and pack everything we could carry. We'd need to come back tomorrow with the others to get the rest. As daylight faded, Terence became increasingly agitated, constantly checking his watch and hurrying us along. "We need to get back to camp before dark," he insisted. "I don't want to be here after sundown." We loaded up our packs with as much meat as we could safely carry, plus the hide and head, which I wanted for a mount. The trek back was tense. The forest that had seemed merely wild during daylight now felt menacing. Shadows stretched between trees, and every crack of a branch made us pause. About halfway back to camp we heard it, a long, low vocalization that started as something like a moan and rose to a howl before dropping again. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the berry patch we'd found earlier, maybe half a mile away. "Move faster," Terence said quietly, adjusting his heavy pack. "Don't run, but don't dawdle either." A few minutes later, the call came again, but from a different direction, now from our right and seemingly closer. Then another call answered from behind us, different in pitch but similar in pattern. Two creatures communicating. "They're tracking us," Terence whispered. "You don't know that," Dave responded, but his voice cracked with tension. "Just keep moving," I said. The light was fading fast now, and the forest floor was becoming treacherous with hidden roots and rocks. I stumbled once, nearly dropping my rifle, and as I regained my footing, I caught a whiff of that same musky odor we'd smelled on the bear's wounds. It was faint but unmistakable. Then came the sound of breaking branches, heavy footfalls moving parallel to our path, just inside the denser part of the forest where visibility was poor. Something big was pacing us, staying just out of clear sight. Sometimes the footsteps would stop when we stopped. Other times they continued without concern for stealth. About a quarter mile from camp, I saw it. Or at least I saw something. Just a dark shape moving between trees, about 40 yards to our left, taller and wider than a man. It was upright but hunched forward, and it moved with a fluid grace that no bear possesses. I only caught a glimpse before it disappeared behind a large cedar, but that was enough to make my heart race. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Terence. He nodded, but didn't slow down. "Keep moving. They're curious, maybe angry about the bear, but they usually avoid direct confrontation." "Usually," Dave hissed. We picked up our pace, the heavy packs digging into our shoulders. The constant feeling of being stalked was worse than any physical discomfort. The vocalizations continued, sometimes sounding like they were right behind us, other times more distant. Occasionally, we'd hear wood knocking against wood, sharp, deliberate sounds that couldn't be natural. When we finally saw the glow of our camp through the trees, I nearly wept with relief. Mike and Keith were there looking concerned. They'd heard our shot hours ago and expected us back much earlier. "We were about to come looking for you," Mike said, then noticed our expressions. "What happened out there?" "Got a bear," Dave said tersely, dropping his heavy pack with a thud. "A big one, but there's something else out there." We quickly recounted our experience while securing the meat on a bear hang well above the ground. Keith, the younger guide, looked skeptical at first, but Terence pulled him aside and spoke quietly. Whatever he said made Keith's expression change from doubt to concern. We built the fire up larger than usual that night, none of us saying why, but all knowing the reason. The calls continued after dark, sometimes close, sometimes far away, but always circling our camp. Around midnight, something threw a rock that landed just outside our fire ring with a heavy thud. Not thrown to hit us, it seemed, but to let us know they were still there. Nobody slept much. I kept my rifle across my lap all night, though deep down I wasn't sure I could bring myself to shoot at whatever was stalking us unless directly attacked. There was something too aware about them, too intelligent. At first light, we broke camp quickly. The plan to retrieve the rest of the bear meat was abandoned by unanimous decision. We'd taken enough, and none of us wanted to return to that valley. The hike out to our vehicles was tense, but uneventful. The calls had stopped with the dawn, and that feeling of being watched gradually faded as we put distance between ourselves and the area. When we reached civilization, Terence asked us not to spread the story around too much. "These creatures have survived by staying hidden," he explained. "The last thing they need is a bunch of hunters or thrill seekers coming in looking for them." I agreed, and for years I've kept this experience mostly to myself. The local indigenous people apparently know about these creatures, respect them, and leave them alone. After what I experienced, that seems like the wisest approach. I still have the bear rug in my den. Sometimes, when looking at it, I can't help but wonder about what really happened in those woods. What exactly had attacked this massive predator with enough force to leave it wounded and retreating? The 5-fingered claw marks still visible on the preserved hide offer a sobering reminder that perhaps we don't know the wilderness as well as we think we do. I haven't been back to that part of British Columbia since. Some places and some creatures are best left undisturbed. But I'll never forget the sounds of those calls echoing through the valley, or the brief glimpse of something tall and powerful moving through the trees with a grace that defied its size. Whatever it was, it belonged to those forests in a way that we, as mere visitors, never will. Story 12. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 10 years now. I was 17 when it happened, out camping with my family and some family friends near the Alpine Lakes Wilderness in the Cascades. This was August 2014, right before my senior year of high school. We'd been going to this same general area for years. My dad loves recreational gold dredging, so we'd set up camp near this creek where they'd spend hours filtering through sediment, while us kids would explore, swim, or ride around on the four-wheelers we'd bring along. That morning started like any other camping day. It was warm, but not hot yet. Probably around 10 a.m. when I decided to take one of the four-wheelers out exploring. I'd ridden these trails dozens of times over the years and knew them pretty well. My parents were fine with me going alone since I had my phone, though reception was spotty at best, and I wasn't planning to go far. I took this dirt road that branches off from our campsite and followed it until I hit this narrower trail I remembered from previous trips. It was one of my favorite spots because it was peaceful, with these patches of sunlight breaking through the trees, and sometimes you'd see deer moving through the undergrowth. The forest there is dense but beautiful, tall pines and firs creating this cathedral-like feeling when you're riding through. After about 20 minutes of riding, I noticed the trail getting more overgrown than I remembered. The path was narrowing, with branches starting to scrape the sides of the four-wheeler. I decided it wasn't worth potentially scratching up my dad's machine, so I found a small clearing to turn around in. That's when everything changed. As I was positioning the four-wheeler to head back, I spotted movement in the trees maybe 30 feet away. A young black bear, probably a yearling, emerged from the underbrush. This wasn't that unusual. We'd seen bears before, though usually from a greater distance. I shut off the engine immediately, not wanting to startle it, but something was off about this bear. Instead of being curious or cautious like bears normally are, this one looked terrified. Its eyes were wide, and it was moving in this jerky, panicked way. Before I could even process what was happening, the bear did something I still can't explain. It ran straight toward me and the four-wheeler. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was frozen, watching this bear that should have been avoiding me at all costs rushing toward me instead. When it reached the four-wheeler, it actually pressed itself against the side of the machine, like it was hiding. I could hear its ragged breathing, could see its fur trembling. A few seconds later, I heard crashing through the underbrush, and an adult black bear, had to be the mother, burst out of the trees from the same direction. Again, I expected her to rear up, to charge at me to protect her cub. That's what everything I've ever learned about bear encounters told me would happen. But she didn't. She looked even more terrified than the yearling. When she saw her cub pressed against my four-wheeler, she made this low huffing sound and nudged the younger bear away. Both of them kept looking back toward whatever part of the forest they'd come from. They moved past me, the mother practically shoving her cub ahead of her. I was confused, relieved they weren't interested in me, but also increasingly uneasy. What makes two bears run like that? What scares a mother bear so badly she's more focused on fleeing than defending her cub? I got my answer seconds later. From somewhere in the forest, the same direction the bears had come from, came the most horrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. It started as this low, guttural roar that raised every hair on my body, then crescendoed into this high-pitched scream that seemed to echo through the entire valley. It lasted maybe 6 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The only way I can describe it is like a lion's roar mixed with a human scream, but that doesn't do it justice. It was primal and intelligent at the same time. It communicated rage and territory and power all at once. I've heard cougars scream. I've heard elk bugle. I've heard all sorts of wildlife make all sorts of noises. This wasn't any of those. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key to start the four-wheeler. I didn't even check to see if the bears were still nearby. I just gunned it down the trail, branches whipping against my arms and face as I tore through sections I'd carefully navigated just minutes earlier. I made it back to the main dirt road and didn't slow down until I reached our campsite by the creek. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because my dad and his friend Jeff immediately stopped what they were doing and came over. "You okay, Connor?" my dad asked, his hand on my shoulder. I was breathing hard, trying to form words. "Did you guys hear that? That scream?" They exchanged looks. Jeff nodded slowly. "Yeah, we heard it. Sounded like it came from up the mountain a ways." "The bears," I said, still trying to catch my breath. There were 2 bears, and they were terrified of something. As if on cue, there was commotion farther down the creek. My little sister Emma and Jeff's kids were pointing across the water. The same 2 black bears I'd encountered were moving rapidly along the opposite bank, still with that same panicked energy. They crossed the creek about 100 yards downstream, sending up sprays of water, and disappeared into the forest on our side. "Those are the ones," I said. "They were running from whatever made that sound." My dad frowned. Probably just a territorial dispute. Another bear, maybe a big male, or possibly a mountain lion. But I could tell from his expression he didn't fully believe that explanation. Mountain lions can make hair-raising screams, but this was different, and bears don't typically make sounds like that at all. The adults in our group had a quick, quiet discussion while I sat on a rock trying to calm down. I noticed they kept their voices low so the younger kids couldn't hear. Eventually, they seemed to decide it was nothing to worry about and went back to their dredging. My mom gave me a sandwich and told me to take it easy for a while. After about an hour, I started feeling restless. The sound was still echoing in my head, but the rational part of my brain was trying to talk me down. It was broad daylight. We were a group of 8 people. Whatever it was probably far away by now. I decided to take the four-wheeler again, but this time in the opposite direction, toward this meadow about a mile from our camp. It was wide open, nowhere for anything to hide, and I figured the sunshine and open space would help clear my head. The ride to the meadow was uneventful. It was a beautiful spot, with wildflowers and tall grass swaying in the breeze. Mountains rose up on 3 sides, with dense forest covering their slopes. I parked at the edge of the meadow and just sat there for a while, letting the sun warm my face, trying to convince myself I'd overreacted earlier. That's when I noticed movement at the edge of the tree line on the far side of the meadow, near where the mountain slope started to rise steeply. At first, I thought it might be the bears again, but this was different. This was much larger. Between 2 massive pine trees, partly obscured by shadow, stood something. It was upright like a person, but much bigger. From that distance, maybe 150 yards, I couldn't make out details clearly, but what I could see was a large, dark figure covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair. It was just standing there, half hidden by the trees, watching the meadow, watching me. I sat perfectly still, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong. The stance was too comfortable, too natural. It had broad shoulders that tapered to a narrower waist. The arms hung at its sides like a person's would. As I stared, frozen, it suddenly turned and began moving up the mountainside. That's when I truly understood how big it was. It pushed through thick brush that would have stopped a human in their tracks, moving with this powerful, fluid motion that was both graceful and terrifying. I could hear branches snapping and undergrowth being crushed even from that distance. It moved uphill with shocking ease, navigating the steep terrain like it was nothing. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, watching this thing climb the mountain at a pace that would have exhausted even the most fit hiker. Eventually, it disappeared into the denser forest higher up the slope. I rode back to camp much more slowly this time, my mind racing. I kept trying to tell myself it was a bear, had to be a bear, what else could it be? But bears don't move like that. They don't stand like that. They don't navigate steep, brush-covered terrain with that kind of bipedal ease. When I got back, I pulled my dad aside. He must have seen the look on my face because he immediately stepped away from the others. "Dad, I saw something," I said, keeping my voice down. "Up by the meadow." I told him everything, the figure at the tree line, how it moved uphill, the way it pushed through the brush. As I was finishing, another scream echoed from the mountain. Fainter this time, but unmistakably the same sound I'd heard earlier. Everyone in camp froze. Even the younger kids sensed something was wrong. My dad and Jeff exchanged looks again. "We should pack up," Jeff said quietly. "Weather's supposed to turn tomorrow anyway." My dad nodded, but then turned to me. "Show me where you saw it." I didn't want to go back there, but I also desperately needed someone else to see what I'd seen, to validate that I wasn't losing my mind. So I took Dad on the four-wheeler, with Jeff following on another one. We left the other adults with the kids back at camp. When we reached the meadow, everything looked peaceful again. There was no sign of the creature, but Dad wanted to check the area where I'd seen it enter the forest. We rode around the perimeter of the meadow until we reached the spot. What we found still gives me chills to think about. The underbrush was trampled and broken in a clear path leading up the mountainside. But it was more than just broken branches. Several saplings, trees maybe 4 or 5 inches thick, had been completely snapped. Not cut, not gradually bent over, but snapped with force. In one spot, it looked like something had actually pulled a small tree out of the ground entirely, roots and all. There were broken branches and debris scattered everywhere. My dad and Jeff didn't say much as they surveyed the damage. They're both outdoorsmen, have been hunting and camping their whole lives. They know what bear sign looks like. This wasn't that. "We're leaving today," my dad finally said. "Let's get back to camp." We packed up in record time. No one complained, even though we'd planned to stay 2 more nights. As we were loading the trucks, I overheard some of the adults talking in low voices. Apparently, several of them had heard the screams, but hadn't wanted to frighten the kids by mentioning it. On the drive home, my dad finally addressed what happened. "Connor, I don't know what you saw up there. I'm not saying it was or wasn't anything specific, but whatever it wasn't something I want my family around." That was almost 10 years ago, and I still think about it regularly. I've researched everything I could find about wildlife in the Cascades, trying to explain what I saw and heard. Nothing fits. Not bears, not cougars, nothing. I've never gone back to that specific camping spot, though we still camp in other areas of the Cascades. Sometimes when I'm in the forest, I find myself scanning the trees, listening intently for any unusual sounds. Sometimes I dream about that scream and wake up in a cold sweat. I don't know what I encountered that day. I'm not claiming it was anything supernatural or mythical. All I know is that something large, powerful, and terrifying was in those woods. Something that scared even the bears. Something that moved through difficult terrain with unnatural ease. Something that could make a sound I never want to hear again as long as I live. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet, I can't shake the feeling that it knew exactly what I was too. Story 13. I've never shared this publicly before. It's been 34 years, but what happened that day in December 1989 still keeps me up at night. I'm only writing this now because I can't keep carrying this alone, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. My name is Marcus. I was 23 back then, living in Pendleton, Oregon, with not much going on in my life, except working at my uncle's hardware store and hanging out with my buddy Ryan. We were both into hunting. Nothing serious, just weekend trips when we could get away. That December, we planned a hunting trip near Deschutes National Forest, south of Bend. Just a normal day trip. Nothing special. God, how I wish we'd just stayed home and watched the football game instead. It was December 3rd, a cold Sunday morning with light snow on the ground. Not enough to cause problems driving, just enough to dust everything white. We left Pendleton around 5 a.m. in Ryan's old Ford pickup, his Remington rifle and my Winchester in the rack behind our heads, a cooler of beer in the back, stupid, I know, but we were young, and enough sandwiches to last the day. The drive took about 2.5 hours. We were taking these back roads, not even sure if they had names, just dirt paths really, winding through the dense forest. The radio was fuzzy out there, so we just talked about random stuff. Work, girls, the usual. Ryan had this girlfriend named Shelley he couldn't shut up about. I remember thinking how normal everything felt. Around 8 a.m. we were crawling along a narrow forest road when Ryan suddenly hit the brakes. "Coyote," he whispered, nodding toward a patch of trees about 50 yards ahead. I saw it too, grayish-brown, slinking between the pines. Without even thinking, Ryan grabbed his rifle, rolled down the window and took a shot. The crack echoed through the trees, scaring a bunch of birds that took off in a flurry of wings. "Got him!" Ryan shouted. The coyote had dropped, but then stumbled back up and disappeared into the thicker part of the forest. There was blood on the snow, though, a clear trail. We parked the truck on the side of the road and grabbed our rifles and backpacks. It was freezing cold, maybe 20 degrees, and our breath came out in big white clouds. My boots crunched in the snow as we followed the blood trail. Small, bright red drops at first, then bigger splotches as we went deeper into the trees. The forest was dead quiet except for our breathing and footsteps. No birds, no wind, just silence and the smell of pine. The blood trail led us to a small ridge about a quarter mile from the road. Nothing steep, just a gradual slope up about 20 feet. We climbed it slowly, still following those red spots in the white snow. When we reached the top of that ridge, everything changed forever. About 300 feet ahead, standing perfectly still in a small clearing, was something. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was huge, standing upright on 2 legs, at least 7 feet tall. Broad shoulders, massive arms hanging by its sides. Dark, almost black hair covered its entire body. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. It wasn't a man in a suit. No way. It was just watching us. Not moving, not making any sound, just staring. "What the fuck is that?" I whispered, but Ryan didn't answer. His face had gone completely white. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We stood frozen like that for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. The thing didn't move either, like we were all caught in some weird standoff. Then Ryan raised his rifle. I grabbed his arm and hissed, "What are you doing?" "I'm gonna shoot it," he said, his voice steady but strange. "Are you crazy? We don't even know what it is." But Ryan was already looking through his scope, steadying his breathing the way he always did before a shot. I remember thinking this couldn't be happening, that we should just back away slowly and get the hell out of there. The crack of the rifle was deafening in the silence. I saw the creature jerk backward, a dark spot appearing on its chest. It didn't roar or scream. It just slowly tilted backward and fell into the snow with a heavy thud that I swear I could feel through my boots. "Holy shit," Ryan kept saying. "Holy shit, holy shit." My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. "What did you do? What the fuck did you do?" But Ryan was already moving forward, walking toward the fallen creature. He had this weird look on his face, almost excited. "Come on," he called back to me. "Let's see what it is." Everything in me was screaming to run back to the truck, but I followed him anyway. As we got closer, I could see the thing more clearly, and my stomach turned over. It was lying on its back in the snow, arms at its sides. The hair covering its body was thick and matted, dark brown, almost black. But its face was different. Less hair there, with exposed skin that looked leathery and weathered, a dark grayish-brown color. Its nose was wide and flat, its mouth broad. Its eyes were closed, but I swear to God I could see them moving under the lids, twitching. Its chest was rising and falling with shallow breaths. It was still alive. Ryan stood over it, rifle still in his hands, looking down with this expression I'll never forget, somewhere between fascination and horror. The thing was massive, at least 6.5 feet long, with thick, powerful limbs and a broad chest, where blood was now seeping out from the bullet wound, pooling in the dips between its ribs. The red was so bright against the white snow. Its hands, I can't stop thinking about its hands. They were moving slightly, fingers opening and closing. They looked almost human, but bigger, with thick fingers and dark nails. Too human. "What is it?" I whispered. Ryan shook his head. "Bigfoot, Sasquatch, I don't know. Those aren't real." Even as I said it, I was looking right at the thing. "Well, what the fuck do you call this then?" Ryan snapped. We stood there for maybe 20 seconds, just staring. The creature's chest kept rising and falling, but growing weaker. Blood continued spreading across the snow. It made no sound, no moaning, no breathing noises, just silence. Then it hit me all at once, what we'd done. We'd shot I didn't even know what to call it. But it wasn't an animal, it was something else, something that shouldn't exist but clearly did. "We need to go," I said suddenly, grabbing Ryan's arm. "Right now." Ryan looked at me like I was crazy. "We can't just leave it. Do you know what we've found? No one's ever... We need to go!" I was nearly shouting now, panic rising in my throat. "We don't know what this is. We don't know if there are more. We need to get out of here." Something in my voice must have triggered Ryan's own fear, because suddenly he nodded, and without another word, we both turned and ran. We ran like hell back down that ridge, following our own footprints in the snow, not looking back. My lungs burned in the cold air, and branches slapped against my face, but I didn't slow down. When we reached the truck, we threw our rifles in the back and jumped in. Ryan's hands were shaking so bad he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he slammed it into reverse, then drive, tires spinning in the snow before catching. We fishtailed onto the dirt road and took off. Neither of us spoke for at least 20 minutes. Ryan drove like a maniac, taking turns too fast, the truck sliding on patches of ice. I kept looking out the back window, expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing, just empty road disappearing into the trees. "What did we just do?" I finally asked, my voice cracking. Ryan gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "We don't tell anyone, ever. You understand? No one would believe us anyway." "But it might still be alive back there. We shot it. We can't just..." "We can and we will," Ryan cut me off. "What do you think happens if we tell someone? Best case, they think we're crazy or lying. Worst case, they believe us. And then what? We shot something that looks half human. You want to go to jail?" He was right, and I knew it. So we made a pact right there in that truck. We would never speak of it again. Not to each other, not to anyone. We drove straight back to Pendleton without stopping once. I remember staring at my hands, seeing dried blood under my fingernails from where I'd fallen in the snow near the blood trail. It made me sick. As soon as Ryan dropped me off at my apartment, I ran to the bathroom and threw up, then stood in the shower for nearly an hour, scrubbing my skin raw. Ryan and I barely spoke after that day. We'd see each other around town and nod, but that was it. About 6 months later, he moved away. Seattle, I think. I never heard from him again. I kept the secret for years, tried to convince myself it was just a bear or something, that the stress and shock had made me see things that weren't there. But I knew better. I remembered those hands, those almost human hands. In 1996, 7 years after it happened, I finally broke down and told my cousin after too many beers at a family reunion. He didn't believe me, laughed it off. but must have mentioned it to someone else because a few months later I got a call from this guy claiming to be a researcher of unexplained phenomena. He wanted me to tell him everything. I don't know why, but I did. Maybe I needed to get it off my chest, or maybe I was hoping he'd tell me I was crazy, that what I'd seen was impossible. Instead, he believed me. He flew out to Oregon, and I even drove with him to Bend, trying to find that ridge again. But everything looked different without the snow, and there were so many similar formations. 7 years had changed the landscape. Logging operations had cleared some areas. New growth had sprung up in others. I couldn't find it. The guilt never left me. I moved to Sisters, Oregon a few years later, got a teaching job at the high school, started a new life. When that researcher contacted me again years later, I panicked and denied everything. Told him Ryan made it all up, said I'd never even met him or gone to Bend. I just wanted it all to go away. But it doesn't go away. I still dream about it. That creature lying in the snow, chest rising and falling, fingers twitching. In my dreams, sometimes its eyes open and look right at me, and I wake up covered in sweat, heart racing. I don't know if it died there on that ridge or if it somehow survived. I don't know if it had a family or if there are more out there in those forests. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw and I know what we did. Sometimes, when I'm hiking in the forests around Sisters, I get this feeling I'm being watched. The birds will suddenly go quiet, and the hair on the back of my neck stands up. I'll turn around, expecting to see something standing there, watching me with those eyes I never actually saw open. But there's never anything there, just trees and silence. I think about going back to that spot with someone who knows those forests better than I do, to see if there's any evidence left after all these years. Bones, perhaps. But I'm afraid of what I might find, and more afraid of what might find me. I carry a gun when I hike now, not for bears or mountain lions, for something else. I'm 57 years old now. I've never married, never had kids. Something broke in me that day in December 1989, and I've never been able to fix it. Sometimes I wonder if Ryan is out there somewhere, carrying the same burden. If he looks over his shoulder in the dark like I do. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I wouldn't if someone told it to me. But it happened. And typing these words is the closest I've come to facing it in 34 years. If you're ever in the forests south of Bend and the birds suddenly go silent and you get that feeling of being watched, don't look back. Just keep walking and don't stop until you're out of the trees. Some things in this world aren't meant to be seen or shot. God help me, I wish we'd just left it alone. Story 14. I still don't know how to feel about what happened last spring. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my mind, talked it through with my wife, even contacted some researchers online about it. But I'm still not sure I believe it myself, even though I know what my boys saw was real. We live just outside Sandy, Oregon, in a house we bought 5 years ago because we wanted to raise our kids somewhere with space to run around. It's a pretty decent-sized property that backs right up to a part of Mount Hood National Forest. When we first moved here, my wife Sarah was a little nervous about being so close to dense woods. You know, worried about bears or cougars, but we'd never had any issues. The boys loved having the forest as their backyard playground, and we had clear rules about how far they could go. When the pandemic lockdown hit in March 2020, I was actually relieved to be out here rather than stuck in some apartment in Portland. I could work from home. Sarah homeschooled the kids, and the boys, Jackson 9 and Ethan 11, had plenty of outdoor space to burn energy. We'd put up a trampoline about 100 yards from the forest edge the previous summer, and they spent hours out there every day while we were all stuck at home. It was a Tuesday in mid-April, April 14th, I think. We'd been in lockdown for about a month by then. The weather had finally turned nice after a pretty miserable wet spell. I was on a Zoom call in my home office when I heard the back door slam and the boys yelling for me and Sarah. Not just excited kid yelling, but that frantic kind of yelling that immediately puts your parents' senses on alert. I quickly made an excuse and ended my call while Sarah came running from the kitchen. The boys burst into the living room, talking over each other, faces flushed and eyes wide. "Dad, Mom, we saw something in the woods." Ethan, my oldest, was literally jumping up and down. "It was watching us from behind a tree," Jackson added, his voice shaking a little. Sarah immediately went into mom mode, getting them to sit down and take turns telling us what happened. At first, I figured they'd seen a deer, or maybe a black bear, which occasionally wander through the area. But as they described what they'd seen, I felt a weird chill creep up my spine. According to the boys, they were bouncing on the trampoline when Jackson noticed something dark standing behind one of the large fir trees at the edge of our property. At first, they thought it might be a shadow, but then they realized it was moving. They both stopped jumping and watched it. "It was so tall, Dad," Ethan said, stretching his arm up as high as he could reach. "Way bigger than you." Jackson nodded enthusiastically. It had its arm up on the tree, like it was leaning on it. He demonstrated, putting his arm up against an imaginary tree. And it was covered in dark hair, like all over. "Like a bear?" Sarah asked, but both boys shook their heads firmly. "Bears don't stand like people," Ethan said with the certainty only an 11-year-old can muster. "This was standing straight up like a really tall, hairy man," Jackson added. "It was watching us for a few seconds, and then when we saw it, it moved back into the trees super fast." I'll admit, my first reaction was to assume they were making it up or exaggerating. Kids their age have active imaginations, and being cooped up during lockdown probably wasn't helping. Plus, they'd been watching those stupid Bigfoot hunting shows on TV occasionally, so I figured that was feeding into it. "Boys, are you sure it wasn't just a bear?" I asked, trying to keep my tone reasonable. "Or maybe a really large deer? The shadows can play tricks on you in the forest." They both got that frustrated look kids get when adults don't believe them. "Dad, we know what bears look like," Ethan said. "This wasn't a bear. It was standing on two legs the whole time." "And it moved way different," Jackson added. "I've seen deer and bears. This was different." Sarah caught my eye over their heads and gave me that look that said, "Humor them." So I nodded and told them I believed they saw something, but that it was probably just some wildlife passing through. I made them promise to come inside immediately if they ever saw anything unusual again, and to not go any closer to the forest edge than the trampoline. That seemed to satisfy them, and they went off to get snacks, the excitement of their discovery already fading in favor of cookies and milk. Sarah and I exchanged looks. "Bigfoot?" she whispered with a raised eyebrow and a smirk. I shrugged and smiled. Lockdown imagination. They've been watching too much TV. We pretty much dropped it after that. The boys mentioned it a couple more times that evening, but we just nodded along without feeding into it too much. I figured they'd forget about it in a day or two. But then, 3 days later, something happened that made me question my dismissal of their story. Sarah was scrolling through our local community Facebook group, you know, the kind where people post about lost dogs and complain about traffic, when she called me over. "Mike, look at this," she said, turning her laptop toward me. It was a post from someone who lived about 5 miles away, closer to the Sandy River. They described seeing what they thought was a possible Sasquatch while hiking a trail near their property. According to the post, they'd spotted a large bipedal creature covered in dark hair, approximately 7 feet tall, walking through the trees about 50 yards off the trail. The person described how it moved quickly but deliberately and disappeared into denser forest within seconds. The post had a bunch of comments, some people making jokes, others sharing their own weird experiences in the area. What struck me was how similar the description was to what our boys had reported. The timing was also notable. This sighting happened just one day after our kids claimed to have seen something. Should we tell the boys? Sarah asked. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to validate what I still thought might be their overactive imaginations, but another part of me was starting to wonder. Let's keep it between us for now, I decided. I don't want to get them all worked up again. That night, after the kids went to bed, Sarah and I talked more about it. The coincidence was strange, especially given how specific both descriptions were. We decided that the next day we'd walk out to where the boys said they saw the creature and check it out ourselves. The following morning was Saturday, so we had no work or school obligations. After breakfast, I casually suggested we all take a family walk out to the edge of our property. The boys were instantly alert. Are we going to look for the forest man? Jackson asked excitedly. We're just going to check things out, I said neutrally. I want to see exactly where you guys were when you thought you saw something. The boys led us out to the trampoline and then pointed to a specific tree at the forest edge. A large Douglas fir with a trunk at least 3 feet in diameter. It was right there, Ethan said, pointing. It was standing behind that tree, but we could see most of it. How much of it could you see? I asked. Everything except part of its middle, Jackson demonstrated by putting his hand over his torso. The tree blocked that part, but we could see its head and shoulder and arm up here, he reached up, and its legs down there. I estimated the height based on where he was pointing and felt that same chill again. If something was standing where they described and was tall enough for its arm to be where Jackson indicated, it would have to be at least 7 feet tall. The 4 of us walked over to the tree they'd pointed out. The ground was soft from recent rain, but I didn't see any obvious footprints or disturbances. There was a game trail leading deeper into the forest from this point, probably used by deer and other wildlife. I looked carefully at the bark of the tree where the boys said the creature had been leaning, but didn't see any hair or marks that seemed unusual. Did it make any noise? Sarah asked the boys as we stood there. They both shook their heads. It was really quiet, Ethan said. That's why we didn't notice it at first. I walked a few paces into the forest, following the game trail. The underbrush got thick pretty quickly, with ferns and berry bushes creating a dense screen. Visibility dropped to maybe 15 or 20 feet once you were inside the tree line. I realized that something could be standing fairly close by in there, and we'd never know it. That thought made me uncomfortable, and I gestured for everyone to head back to the house. As we walked, I noticed both boys kept looking back over their shoulders at the forest edge. I put my hands on their shoulders. Hey, it's okay. Even if there was something there the other day, it didn't try to come closer or bother you, right? It just watched and then left. They nodded, but I could tell they were still uneasy. To be honest, so was I. That night, after the boys were asleep, I found myself going down an internet rabbit hole about Bigfoot sightings in Oregon. I'd always considered these stories to be myths or misidentifications, but reading through detailed accounts from our region, particularly the Mount Hood area, was unsettling. So many descriptions matched what our boys had reported. The height, the dark hair, the way it stood, how quickly it retreated when spotted. One thing that kept coming up in the research was how sightings often increased during times when human activity decreased in an area. Some researchers suggested that these creatures, whatever they were, became more bold when there were fewer humans around. With the pandemic lockdowns in full effect, human presence in the forest had dropped significantly. No hikers, fewer forestry workers, less traffic on the logging roads. I mentioned this to Sarah as we got ready for bed. "You don't actually believe it was a Sasquatch, do you?" she asked, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "I don't know what to believe," I admitted, "but I know our boys. They're imaginative, sure, but they're not liars. And that description from someone else so close by, with the same details." Sarah sat on the edge of our bed. "So what are you saying? That Bigfoot is hanging out at the edge of our yard." When she put it that way, it sounded ridiculous. I shrugged and tried to laugh it off. Probably not. But something spooked the boys, and I'm not completely convinced it was just their imagination. We left it at that, but I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what might be out there in the darkness beyond our property line. Over the next few days, life went on as normal. The boys played outside, but stayed closer to the house than before. They'd occasionally glance toward the forest edge, but didn't mention seeing anything else unusual. I found myself doing the same thing, looking up from my laptop during work calls to scan the tree line visible from my office window. On Thursday night, exactly 9 days after the boys' sighting, something happened that I still can't explain. I was having trouble sleeping and went downstairs around 1 in the morning to get some water. Our kitchen has a large window that faces the backyard, and moonlight was streaming in, casting everything in a silvery glow. As I filled my glass, movement at the edge of our yard caught my eye. I froze, water overflowing my glass into the sink. Something large was moving along the tree line. In the moonlight, I could make out a dark silhouette, significantly taller than a human should be. It appeared to be walking upright, but with an odd rolling gait that was nothing like a person's walk. It moved from one tree to another, pausing briefly at each one, as if checking its surroundings. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my ears. I dimmed the kitchen light and moved closer to the window, trying to get a better look without being seen. The figure moved again, and I caught a glimpse of its profile. It had a broad, sloped shoulder line and what looked like a conical head shape, not quite like a human head and neck, but more like the head sat directly on the shoulders with little definition between. I wanted to run upstairs and wake Sarah, but I was afraid to take my eyes off it. I fumbled for my phone to try and take a video, but by the time I unlocked it and opened the camera, the figure had moved deeper into the forest and out of sight. I stood there for another 20 minutes, glass of water forgotten, staring at the tree line, but it didn't reappear. When I finally went back to bed, Sarah stirred and asked what was wrong. I told her what I'd seen, half expecting her to think I was dreaming or imagining things, but she sat up, fully alert, and listened as I described the figure. "Should we call someone?" she whispered. "The sheriff, maybe." I shook my head. "And tell them what? That I saw a shadowy figure that might have been Bigfoot. They'd think I was crazy or drunk." We both knew she was right. There was no point calling authorities. Even if they did come out, whatever I saw would be long gone, and we'd have no proof. Instead, we agreed to be more vigilant about keeping the boys closer to the house and to set up a trail camera facing that section of the forest edge. The next day, I ordered a motion-activated trail camera online. It wouldn't arrive for several days, so in the meantime, we told the boys they needed to stay within sight of the house, but didn't mention what I'd seen. I didn't want to scare them unnecessarily, but kids are perceptive. They could tell something was up. "Did you see the forest man too, Dad?" Jackson asked me that afternoon as I was pretending to work while actually keeping an eye on them playing in the yard. I hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "I saw something last night, buddy. I'm not sure what it was." His eyes widened. "I knew it. Ethan said you were acting weird today." "Let's not jump to conclusions," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. It was dark, and it could have been anything. A deer standing funny, or maybe even a bear. He gave me that look kids give when they know adults are trying to protect them from something. "It wasn't a bear, Dad." That night, I had trouble sleeping again. I kept getting up to look out our bedroom window, which had a view of most of the backyard. Sarah eventually dozed off, but I stayed awake until nearly dawn, watching and listening. Several times I thought I heard heavy footsteps or breaking branches from the forest, but convinced myself it was just the wind or nocturnal animals. The next few days passed without incident. The trail camera arrived, and I set it up facing the area where both the boys and I had seen the figure. Each morning I checked the footage, but it only captured deer, raccoons, and once a coyote. Just when I was starting to think we'd all experienced some kind of shared delusion, something happened that made my blood run cold. It was almost a week after my nighttime sighting. Sarah had taken the boys into town for groceries, and I was alone at the house on another endless Zoom call in my office. It was around 4 in the afternoon, still fully light outside. My office window faces the side yard, not the back where the forest is. I was half listening to my colleagues discuss quarterly projections when I heard a distinct heavy thud from the back deck, like something heavy had landed on it. My first thought was that a branch had fallen, but then I heard what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing our wooden deck. I muted my microphone and stood up, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped. I moved quietly to the hallway, which gave me a view through the living room to the sliding glass doors that led to the back deck. What I saw there made me freeze in place. Standing on our deck, looking in through the glass door, was exactly what the boys had described. It was enormous. Easily 7 feet tall, maybe more, with broad shoulders covered in dark brown, almost black hair. Its body was massive, muscular, but with a bit of a barrel chest. The face was the most unsettling part, set deep under a pronounced brow ridge, with dark eyes that seemed to reflect no light. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't like any animal I recognized either. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other. I couldn't move. It didn't move. Then, very deliberately, it reached out one massive hand not paw, and placed it flat against the glass door. I noticed the fingers were like ours, but longer, with dark nails or claws. That broke my paralysis. I shouted, I'm not even sure what I said, probably just an incoherent yell, and took a step forward. The creature immediately withdrew its hand, turned with surprising agility, and in 2 enormous strides leapt off our deck and disappeared into the forest. I ran to the door and locked it, then grabbed my phone to call Sarah. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. When she answered, I told her not to come home right away, to stay in town until I called back. She could tell from my voice that something was seriously wrong, but thankfully didn't question me in front of the boys. After hanging up, I checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked, then grabbed a baseball bat from the garage. Part of me wanted to go check the deck for evidence, footprints, hair, anything, but I was too terrified to go outside. Instead, I positioned myself where I could see both the deck and the forest edge, and waited, bat in hand. An hour passed with no further sign of the creature. I called Sarah and told her it was probably safe to come home, but to drive around the house once before getting out, honking the horn to make noise. When they arrived, I met them at the car and hurried everyone inside, locking the door behind us. That evening, I showed Sarah the handprint on the glass door, a faint, smudged outline much larger than my own hand. She took one look at it and said, "We need to call someone about this." The question was who. The sheriff wouldn't take a Bigfoot report seriously. Wildlife authorities would probably say the same thing. Eventually, we found a group online that researched Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. I sent them an email with our experiences and photos of the handprint. To my surprise, they responded within hours. Apparently, our area had seen an uptick in sightings since the pandemic began. Their theory matched what I'd read online. With fewer humans in the forest due to lockdowns, these creatures were expanding their territory or becoming less cautious. They offered to send someone out to investigate, but by then, the handprint had faded completely, and Sarah was reluctant to have strangers coming to our property during a pandemic. Instead, we set up more trail cameras around the property perimeter and established new safety rules for the boys. No going outside without an adult, no playing near the forest edge at all. We also started making more noise when we were outside. playing music, talking loudly, based on the researchers' suggestion that these creatures generally avoid human noise and activity. For the next few weeks, we lived in a state of constant vigilance. The trail cameras captured nothing unusual, and we had no more sightings, though occasionally at night, we'd hear odd vocalizations from the forest. Not quite like any animal call I'd heard before, a sort of low, rumbling, whooping sound that would come in sequences of 3 or 4 calls, then silence. As spring turned to summer and pandemic restrictions began to ease, allowing more people back into the forests for recreation, these strange occurrences stopped completely. No more sounds, no more sightings. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the boys still won't play on the trampoline, and I've noticed they always position themselves so they can see the forest edge, never with their backs to it. I still don't know what to make of what happened during those strange weeks in the spring of 2020. Was it really a Sasquatch or some undocumented species? Was it just an unusually large bear with a deformity that made it appear more humanoid? Or was it some kind of shared delusion brought on by the stress and isolation of the pandemic? What I do know is that something was watching us from the forest edge. Something that was intelligent enough to observe, to approach cautiously, and to retreat when detected. Something that left no tracks, no clear evidence, but that 3 separate members of my family saw with their own eyes. These days, I still find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm in the yard. Sometimes, I swear I can feel eyes watching from the darkness between the trees. And on quiet nights, when the wind is still, I occasionally step onto the deck and listen, half afraid, half hoping to hear that distinctive whooping call echoing from the depths of the forest. Story 15. I don't talk about this much. For almost 60 years I've kept it mostly to myself, except for telling my wife and a couple close friends who probably thought I was making it up anyway. But after seeing similar accounts online recently, I feel like maybe it's time to share what happened to me that summer at Camp Rainier. I was 15 years old, and what I saw changed everything I thought I knew about the world. It was the summer of 1964. My parents had enrolled me in this military-style summer camp near Mount Rainier in Washington State. I wasn't particularly thrilled about it, but my dad thought it would build character. The camp was set up with about 20 wooden cabins arranged in a semicircle in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. In the center of this clearing was a tall light pole with a water fountain underneath it. That light stayed on all night, casting this eerie glow over the whole camp. I bunked with 3 other boys my age in cabin 12, about 2/3 of the way around the semicircle. The cabins were pretty basic, just wooden structures with simple doors that didn't even have locks. We had these small windows that you could prop open with a stick during hot nights, which is what we often did. The days at camp were exhausting. They ran us ragged with drills, hikes, swimming, obstacle courses, typical military-style stuff designed to wear teenage boys out. Most nights, I fell asleep immediately after lights out, but this particular night was different. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what startled me awake. Maybe a noise outside, or just one of those random wake-ups that happen sometimes. I was disoriented at first, trying to figure out what time it was. It was definitely late, that dead-of-night feeling where everything is absolutely still. I'd guess it was somewhere between 1 and 3 in the morning. My bunk was right next to one of the small windows, which we had propped open because it had been a hot day. I rolled over and glanced outside, mostly just trying to see if it was anywhere close to dawn yet. That's when I saw it. Under the central light pole, hunched awkwardly at the water fountain, was something. At first, my sleepy brain thought it must be one of the camp counselors doing a night check or getting a drink, but as my eyes adjusted and I really focused on what I was seeing, I realized this was nothing like a counselor or any human I'd ever seen. This thing was massive, way taller than any man I'd ever seen. It was bent over at an extreme angle, almost folded in half, trying to reach the water fountain that was designed for kids. Even bent over like that, I could tell it would stand well over 7 feet tall if it straightened up. Maybe closer to 8. It had these incredibly long, powerful-looking limbs and was completely covered in dark hair. Not like a beard or long human hair, but a full coat covering its entire body. What really got me was what it was doing at the fountain. It wasn't just drinking normally. It would fill its mouth with water, then tilt its head back and spray the water into the air, almost like it was playing with it. Then it would do it again and again. This went on for maybe a minute or two, and I just lay there frozen, not even breathing, trying to process what I was seeing. After it finished at the fountain, it straightened up, confirming just how enormous it really was, and started walking toward the first cabin in our semicircle. It moved upright on 2 legs, but with this strange gait that was both fluid and powerful, not like a human walk at all. I watched in absolute terror as this thing approached the first cabin and just went inside, just opened the door and went in. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would wake up my cabin mates. The creature only stayed in that first cabin for maybe 10 seconds before coming back out and moving to the next one. It was following the semicircle, methodically checking each cabin, one after another. At this point, I was in complete panic mode. Whatever this thing was, it was working its way around to my cabin, and there was nothing I could do about it. I thought about waking the other guys, but I was honestly too terrified to make a sound. What if it heard me? What would it do? So I just lay there, paralyzed with fear, watching as it moved from cabin to cabin, getting closer to mine. As it got to the cabins that were better lit by the central light, I could make out more details. Its face was not quite human, not quite ape. It had this prominent brow ridge and what looked like a flattened nose. Its movements were deliberate and careful, like it was trying not to make noise. I could see muscles shifting under all that hair as it moved, and I remember thinking how impossibly strong it must be. I tried to convince myself it might be some kind of prank, maybe one of the older counselors dressed up to scare us. But that made no sense. No costume could create that natural movement, that size, that presence. And why would a counselor be sneaking into cabins in the middle of the night? The creature was now just 2 cabins away from mine. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. My mouth was bone dry. I couldn't decide if I should pretend to be asleep when it came in, or if I should try to wake everyone up now before it reached us. Before I could make a decision, something happened. When it entered cabin 10, which was right next to ours, there was a sudden scream. A boy's voice yelled, "Help! Somebody help!" The sound shattered the night silence like a gunshot. The creature's reaction was instant. It burst back out of the cabin and turned toward the forest behind the cabins. I got a clear look at its profile as it moved. It was absolutely massive, with shoulders twice as wide as a normal man's, covered in that dark hair that looked almost blue-black in the artificial light. It ran, not lumbering or shambling like you might expect something so big to move, but with these long, powerful strides that ate up distance at an incredible rate. It moved faster than any human could, especially through that terrain. The edge of the clearing behind our cabins was thick with underbrush and fallen logs, stuff that would trip up a person trying to run through it. This thing just powered through it all, like it wasn't even there, and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Within seconds, lights were coming on in cabins. Counselors were rushing around. Kids were yelling and asking questions. I was shaking so badly I couldn't even get out of my bunk at first. When I finally managed to stumble outside with everyone else, the camp was in chaos. The boy from cabin 10, his name was Matt, was completely hysterical. He kept saying something had come into their cabin, something huge and hairy that smelled like wet dog and garbage. He said it had stood over his bunk and just looked at him for a few seconds before he screamed. His description matched exactly what I had seen from my window. The head counselor tried to calm everyone down, saying it was probably just a bear that had wandered into camp looking for food. But I knew better. Bears don't walk upright through multiple cabins. They don't methodically check structures one by one. They don't play with water fountains. And they certainly don't run through dense forest like it's an open field. The strangest part was how quickly the whole thing was swept under the rug. By morning, the official story was that Matt had a nightmare, or possibly there had been a prowler who got spooked and ran off. The counselors spent about an hour half-heartedly looking around the camp perimeter, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. They didn't even look in the right area where I saw it disappear. Matt's dad showed up the next day and took him home. I overheard them talking about how Matt was too upset to stay and how he kept insisting he saw a monster. His dad looked embarrassed about the whole thing, like his son was making it all up for attention. I wanted to tell Matt I'd seen it too, that I knew he wasn't crazy, but I never got the chance before he left. And honestly, I was too scared to speak up. What if they thought I was making it up too? What if they called my parents and said I was causing trouble? So I kept quiet. For the rest of camp, I hardly slept. I kept my window firmly shut despite the heat, and I would lie awake listening for any sound outside. I never saw the creature again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching us from the trees. Nobody at the camp ever talked about that night again. It was like it had been collectively decided that nothing happened. But I know what I saw. It matched every description of Bigfoot I've ever heard. The height, the build, the hair, the way it moved. I've gone over it in my mind thousands of times in the decades since, and I'm more convinced now than ever that what visited Camp Rainier that night wasn't human. What keeps me up at night, even now, at 74 years old, is wondering what it was doing. Why was it checking the cabins? Why did it fill its mouth with water and spray it upward? Was it curious about us? Was it looking for something specific? I'll never know. I've read about other Bigfoot encounters over the years, but none quite like mine. Most people see them at a distance, walking through the woods or crossing a road. Not many people report them systematically entering buildings or showing that kind of methodical behavior. Maybe that's why I've kept quiet all these years. My experience doesn't fit the typical pattern, so who would believe me? But I know what I saw under that light pole in the summer of '64. I know what moved through our camp with such purpose and power, and I know that somewhere in the forests around Mount Rainier, there are things that science hasn't explained, things that walk upright but aren't men, things that can vanish into the wilderness without a trace. Sometimes, when it's very late at night and I can't sleep, my mind goes back to that moment, looking out my cabin window and seeing something impossible crouched at the water fountain. And I wonder if somewhere out there, it remembers me too.